Well, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians Podcast with Alex Gran and Jim Thompson. Some also call us the Colgate Comedy Hour. I don't know if you guys know that. Jim, wave to the audience.
I didn't know that.
At any rate, we have a fun guest today, Mr. Tom Brevoort, Executive Editor and VP over at Marvel Comics. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, happy to be here.
So we're going to go hopscotch through your life. Jim's going to start in your early years, then I'm going to hit you with some Marvel in the 90s. So go ahead, Jim.
Okay, so you were born in 1967. Was it in New York? I wasn't quite sure.
It was in New York, yes, in Queens.
Okay, and your dad worked at a bank, or was he a banker, or what was his job there?
Yeah, my dad worked for Chase Manhattan Bank. He was like a loan officer and dealt with banking things.
And what about your mom?
My mom had worked for the bank as well. When they got married, she became a homemaker and took care of the kids and was just a mom for the longest time. Eventually, she went back to work and did other things. But during all of my formative years, she was around constantly.
Now, I know you had one brother. Did you have other siblings?
I have three brothers.
Okay.
So I am the oldest, and the others are all separated from me by periods of 3 years. So 3, 6, 9.
So there was a schedule.
Yes. It was very regimented. It all timed out perfectly.
Now, I was reading about your early reading in comics and things, and how you would go in, and I think it was 1973, your dad took you in a 7-Eleven and said, "Hey, you want a comic?" And you said yes, because you're no fool. And,
right.
And that's how it started. Is that right?
That is exactly right. My dad was a smoking fiend. He smoked a lot, as a lot of people did in 1973. And so he'd go through a carton or two of cigarettes a week, and so the 7-Eleven was a regular stop on our travels. And so that particular day, and I don't know why this was, other than they must have been cleaning some area or doing something. Typically, it was a comic book spinner rack like the one behind me that I got the book off of, and typically that was further into the 7-Eleven, more in the back where the magazines and things were. But this day, for whatever reason, it was right up in the front, right near the front door, which is an awful place to put it if you're a 7-Eleven, because it's the easiest thing in the world for somebody to grab a book and head out the door immediately. But for whatever reason, we were waiting in line, to pay, to buy the cigarettes and to pay for them. And I wandered over and was looking at the spinner rack, just looking at it. And my dad said, "Do you want one?" And I said, "Yeah, okay, fine." And I can still remember books that were on the rack that I didn't buy. But I ended up, I went with the safest choice you could make, which is I bought an issue of Superman.
And that was Superman 268 with Batgirl, a Nick Hardy cover with Batgirl and Batman's inside of it. And
Yep. Wild Weekend in Washington.
Right. So that's your first one. But out of that first year, and you're 6 years old at the time,
yeah.
Within that year, was there a better comic that spoke to you more? Or is that the one that hooked you?
I don't know if I was completely hooked at that point. At 6, I could read, but I was only so at it. I was still learning. Really, probably the book that kicked me over the edge and really made me a fanatic. It would have been, I would have had maybe, two, maybe my second book, my third book, something like that, was a 100-page Flash super spectacular that reprinted Flash stories from the 60s and even a Jay Garrick story from the 40s. And there was an Elongated Man story and a Johnny Quick story. And that book particularly the Flash, and Carmine Infantino and John Broome and that period really clicked with me. That was, I think, more than anything, the one book that got me on board full time.
Oh, that's great. Now, I noticed that even though you were buying DC books, when Halloween came around in October, you were dressed up as Spider-Man.
Yes.
And your younger brother was dressed up as Batman. You were the Marvel guy.
Yeah. So, again, that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the comic reading yet. That was just you know, in those days you had the Ben Cooper costumes, and every year, you know, we would go out to the drugstore or wherever and, you know, pick a costume and that would be the Halloween costume. And at that point, I don't think there was any great thought process put into it. You know,
just kind of a merchandising, consuming some merchandise a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I knew Spider-Man from the '67 cartoon, which would play regularly on you know, on afternoon television. So I was at least familiar with the character, and the same thing with Batman. The you know, Batman '66 show was still in reruns on Channel 11. Spider-Man was on Channel 5.
But you were more of a DC and even Flash fan, and a few years later, you had your mom actually make you a Flash costume homemade, right?
Yes. My mom, you know, who was very nice and very accommodating on a lot of things, did in fact create for me, for, you know, one of the later Halloweens, a full-on Flash costume, homemade Flash costume. There's a couple of photos of it that are floating around because I've posted them over the years. It's obviously long gone now, but it was, and it was confusing for everybody else because nobody in 1973 or 74, 75, whenever it would have been, nobody knew who the Flash was.
You know, it's so funny because I went every Monday to 7-Eleven. I would get there as they delivered the packages and wait for the guy to open, use the wire cutters, put them on the racks. I wasn't allowed to touch them until they were on the racks. And then I would get my comics. And my first homemade Halloween costume was Kid Flash that my mom.
That's amazing. We should have gone out. We should have gone out. We should have gone out together. That would have been. we probably would have scored some nice swag.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think my first comics were also at 7-Eleven on the news rack. It was Power Man and Iron Fist with Chemistro on the cover, shooting up, and then and then Gargoyle 2 by DeMatteis, and I was like, oh, what's this? And those are great memories. That rack was by the door as well, like yours was.
Right.
I love that. And then there was a point where my dad started taking me to Clay Bookstore in Richmond, Virginia, because they had a better collection and better stuff than what I was getting at 7-Eleven. And understanding is you had a similar experience with that too. Your father took you to was it a card store, or it was something like that?
Well, in the short term, 7-Eleven was kind of my main source for a long while. Eventually, around, I'm going to say 1980, maybe 1979, there was a strip mall that was closer to our home, and a stationery store went in there that started to stock comics, and they were better and more regular than the 7-Eleven, so I kind of switched over to using them. Eventually, though, in the mall area where my dad's office was, there was a Chase Manhattan Bank location there that he operated out of. They opened up a Heroes World, one of the early comic shops based on Ivan Snyder's mail service. And so some day, he came home in, I'm guessing it's 78 at this point. And said, "Hey, they've opened up this store." And he didn't tell me it was where he worked, because he knew that once I found that out, and in fact, I absolutely did, I would abuse the hell out of that. But he said, "Hey, I've discovered." I assumed he'd read it in the newspaper or something. They're opening this thing. Do you want to go check it out? And I was like, "Oh yeah, I definitely want to go." And so I went out to this Heroes World. My dad drove me out to Levittown. And that was my first comic book shop experience.
And your dad was taking you into the city and to conventions at this point too, in the early 70s, right?
It was more like, it was probably closer to the beginning of the 80s, 80, 81. We were only in New York until November of 81, and that's when we moved. The family relocated to Delaware. But in like 1980, 1981, maybe even 79, we went to a bunch of conventions, which were more like in those days, comic book shows. There were a few of them that were out on Long Island. There's at least one I can remember that was in the Holiday Inn. That was really nothing more than a big room with a lot of dealers.
Right.
But we would travel, take the LIRR into the city and go to the actual bigger conventions that were held in the hotels there. He let myself and whatever buddies might have come along with me loose into the place for a couple of hours and say, okay, be back here at whatever time, 5 o'clock. And I would never make it back by 5. It would always be 5:30 or 6 or 6:15. And I would always be dreading like, oh, I'm going to get clobbered for not having been there. But it never actually became an issue. Like I suspect him being smarter than me, he kind of figured that was the way it was going to work. And so if he wanted it to be 6, he would say 5.
Now you were not reading right around the time of the classic Marvel stuff, but you were picking up all of the reprint books and discovering the classic era of Ditko and Kirby through reprints. Is that right?
Yeah, I wasn't a Marvel reader at first. That when I started reading comics, I started obviously with the DCs, and though I didn't realize it at the time, my tastes in those days were very heavily for Julie Schwartz edited superhero comics. That what he did was what I liked. So whether it was Flash or Justice League or Superman or Batman or his stint on Wonder Woman or whatnot, that's really the common factor that was there that really appealed to me. And I sampled other comics. People would buy me comics, because they knew I was interested. And, I had 3 or 4 different attempts at reading Marvel books. And the Marvel books just did not work for me as a 7-year-old. For one thing, they were always continued, and that was always a problem because I could never be sure that I was going to pick up be able to get a follow-up issue. It was also frustrating because for whatever reason, I think Len Wein was the editor-in-chief at that time, and Len had a predilection, and he did it time and time again, where whatever the cover scene would end up being like the cliffhanger of the issue. So you'd buy a comic with whatever Captain America's being thrown into a volcano, and you'd be like, oh my God, Cap's being thrown into a volcano. How is he going to get out? And you'd read through the book, and the last page would be whatever, the Red Skull throwing Cap into the volcano, going, you will never survive this volcano, Star-Spangled Schweinhund. And I'd go, oh, I've been cheated. I need the next one to find this out.
They tricked me.
And honestly, too, a lot of the Marvel books at that time were playing towards a much older audience than I was at 7. Some of the books that I read are just plain mediocre, but some of them are actually really good. They're just not aimed at me. The first issue of Captain America I ever read was the last part of the Nomad story that Steve Englehart did.
Oh yeah,
and it's a great issue now, but as a kid, it confused the heck out of me because the lead character in this issue is Nomad, this guy running around in a black and yellow costume. Meanwhile, there's another guy who's Captain America, who's doing stuff with the Falcon, and the Falcon is kind of training him, and they run afoul of the Red Skull. And it turns out that Captain America gets crucified on the top of this building, by the Red Skull, and Nomad shows up, and it's like, oh my God, what's happened? And then by the end of the issue, he puts the costume on, and he's Captain America. And I went, what? Did they just kill Captain? What is this? And I didn't have the next one. All I knew was this was not what I wanted from my superhero entertainment.
It's
at
really
7.
intense stuff, yeah.
And if you had bought just 2 issues earlier, you would have had Nixon killing himself as the head of the Secret Empire.
Yes. Although I don't know that I would have gotten that reference if I'd read it that early.
Right.
So for the longest time, I was not really a Marvel reader. And eventually, I think it was the summer of '77, I made the leap, and I became interested in the Human Torch because I had Jules Pfeiffer's book, The Great Comic Book Heroes.
Right.
That was remaindered for like years. It was published in '65, but there were copies, all throughout the '70s, and I got a copy of that. And I bought it and I devoured it, except I didn't read the Marvel chapters. I didn't read the Marvel stories because I didn't like Marvel, so I didn't read them, which is crazy. But there was one day, sometime in the summer, where there was nothing going on, and I was looking at the book, or I pulled it out for some reason, and I just kind of went, okay, I guess I'll read these. They're here. I haven't read them before.
Oh, and they're great. I mean, those.
I liked the Human Torch story, and so that made me go, okay, I'll check out. I'll see what's going on with this now. Through osmosis, and because there was enough stuff around, I knew that the Human Torch was part of the Fantastic Four. And in my area, what became my other big source of comics for a while was there's a drugstore that my family used to go to as part of a chain. I stopped mentioning it by name because I don't know if they still exist, and I really don't need to be sued. But they were a drugstore, and they had this really big bin, like a wire, chicken wire bin filled with comics. I remember it as being massive, although probably proportionally it wasn't all that huge. But it was a bin. It was entirely Marvel, pretty much. Every once in a while, a random copy of Detective Comics or Action Comics would sneak in. But it was all Marvel, and it was all older books. All books that were, some between 9 months to 3 years old. And what I worked out years later, it took me a couple of years to have the background to figure this out, is these were all returns that had been reported destroyed and that somebody had sold to the drugstore chain out of the back of the warehouse. So there was this bin, and they would sell the books for like, $5 for $1. And I went to the bin, and I went digging around in it, and I pulled out 3 consecutive issues of Fantastic Four. 177, 178, 179. Cost me 50 cents. And I went home and I read those, and I liked them. And so the next time, later on in the week or the following week, we ended up back in the drugstore for stuff. I dug around in the bin again, and I came up with 3 issues of Marvel's Greatest Comics, which was 58, 59, and 60. And those were Stan and Jack books. In the 70s, as you'll remember, Marvel had a full line of reprint titles. Pretty much anything that was a mainstay book had a sister title that was reprinting stories from 9 or 10 years earlier. So that's how I experienced a lot of this stuff.
I like how affidavit return fraud is the genesis of your Marvel experience.
Yes, it is. and so many. And eventually, again, the other big clue to that was eventually that bin went away, and instead the drugstore started selling these like pre-bound, wrapped in plastic, 5 books, all with the covers stripped. And those too were still, illegal returns coming from the same source. But by that point, affidavit returns had ended, and they were back to stripping the books. And that didn't last very long. I suspect those were not as appealing to consumers. And certainly, a bundle of 5 where you could see 1, maybe 2 if the back one happened to be turned around. That was not a gamble I was willing to take a lot of the time.
Right. So I want to get you to college, but I'm going to be indulgent for a second and ask you a question.
Yep.
Tell me what the 5 books of Owen Deaver is and what the Hanging Cross is. Do you know?
Yeah, those are both episodes of Have Gun Will Travel.
Yes. Very good. You like season 2. My 2 favorite episodes are those 2 from season 1. And we can talk about this after. I just wanted to say I'm with you on Have Gun Will Travel. It's
excellent.
My favorite TV Western.
That is a great show. I came to it very late. I only came to it a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, maybe. I never saw it. I never watched it as a kid or anything. I was just not a Western guy. I'm still really not a Western guy. But that show is top to bottom terrific.
The storytelling in that is just fantastic. So I'm with you on that 100%. All right. So you moved to Delaware and you attended University of Delaware as an illustration major.
Yes, yes.
So I know you, as a kid, you had drawn your own comics and things from early on. Did you? And I know you thought you were going to be in the industry. Did you think you were going to be a comic book artist?
Yeah, I mean that was sort of my aspiration. I drew comics for years. Again, starting when I was a very young kid, and progressively getting better. And I worked with other people. I would meet like-minded friends, and we would make comics. We sold copies of at least one book that we did out of the local comic shop for a little while. I got connected to fandom, so I did stuff in fanzines and jazz like that. And so, yeah, I definitely had a draw towards the idea that I was going to do this professionally, and I was going to be a comic book artist. I wasn't necessarily good enough, skilled enough to do that, but that was where my aspirations lie.
And in your third summer at school, 1989, you applied to all the comic book companies for an internship, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And Marvel is the only one that contacted you back.
That is also correct. Yes.
So playing the Marvel what if game, what if DC had responded instead of Marvel? What do you think your career would have been like?
I don't know, because certainly I would have interned at DC. Hopefully, in a perfect case scenario, I would have performed as well and been thought of as nicely as I was at Marvel, so that when there was an opening, people might have hired me on over there. But my career trajectory at Marvel is an outlier. Nobody else has one like it. It's not even duplicable. And so I don't know, with all the various changes and shifts and things that DC has gone through in that same period,
right?
What the situation would have been. Would I be at DC for 31 years? Would I have done some time at DC and done work for other companies? Would I have gotten out of the industry at some point? Would I have moved inside? It's impossible to say.
Only the watcher knows.
Yep. But
it could have had one of those Roy Thomas what if endings where everyone dies. Who knows what could have happened?
So at your internship, you had a natural flair. No, all modesty aside, you did a great job, and you got an immediate offer to work for them, which is not an easy thing to have happen.
It wasn't quite immediate, but it was close enough. It was within 3 months.
Now, did you take that and finish school, or what happened there?
I went up to interview. I was made the offer in November, and that offer was made by Danny Fingeroth, who was running the Spider-Man group.
Sure.
And I said, yeah, okay, sure, I'll absolutely come up and be your assistant editor, Danny. And then because I was up at the offices, I went around to talk to the people that I knew, including Bob Budiansky, who was one of the 3 offices that I had interned for over the summer. And I went to and I told Bob, I'm coming back. Danny's going to bring me on to do this thing. And Bob, thought about it for a second, and he said, we're going to need somebody in this department too, but we don't necessarily need them right away. If I could get you hired here, at the end of the year, you could finish out your term, your semester. Would you be up for that? And I went, yeah, of course. And then Bob kind of metaphorically rubbed his hands together and went, let's tell Danny. And we went back through the offices to Danny Fingeroth's office to tell him that, no, I wasn't gonna come on to work for him. I was going to come on and work for Buddha.
Oh, that's great. Alex?
Yeah, so that's cool. So and Bob Budiansky, I think they portrayed him in the Toys That Made Us.
Yes.
They had an actor portray him. So
yes.
Who would have thought of all he would have an actor portray him one time? So that was 1989, and so this is interesting because you've mentioned we've listened to some of your other stuff that you've done as far as interviews, and you're working in front of 3 editorial offices. You mentioned special projects. Bob Budiansky and Dwayne McDuffie, that they were doing like posters, license art, movie adaptations. The Cosmic Office, which you've mentioned, which was Craig Anderson, Renee Witterstatter. That was like What If, Silver Surfer, Guardians of the Galaxy was coming out around that time.
Right.
And then the managing associate editors, Marvel Masterworks, Avengers Spotlight, with Evan Skolnick. So you were kind of working in front
and Greg Wright. Greg Wright was actually the managing editor. Evan was his assistant.
There you go, and Greg Wright. And so you were kind of were you basically during that intern time? Were you just kind of like assisting all these people? What exactly were you doing then?
I mean, I was doing whatever needed to be done. Mm-hmm. Those three offices all were sort of at the end of one corridor of Marvel. So it was a little cul-de-sac where those three offices existed, and I had like a little workstation or table outside of the three. And so whenever there was something that people needed to be done, I would do it. And from my work on fanzines and art and such, like I could do any task that was needed.
I see. You understood like the printing process and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a professional grade letterer, but I can letter. Uh-huh. I could do any kind of paste up that was necessary, production, things like that. When I got to Marvel, and I've said this a lot of times over the years, there was only one computer in the place. There was a single, I think it was an Apple II. Mm-hmm. And I walking in the door, I immediately knew more about how to use it than anybody that was on staff, because it was more of my generation. So I did a lot of typesetting of captions and things.
Yeah.
If you go to the Thanos Quest, the 2-issue Jim Starlin series, there's a whole bunch of balloons in that are lettered in a computery font, and I did the typesetting on all of that.
That's cool.
On the Apple.
Yeah. So you were kind of like the new guy that could help the older people out a bit easier.
Yeah, and I was also, capable of doing whatever was needed. Yeah. Again, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but this was a common theme that came up, is that, people would throw me things, expecting that that's going to take, 4 days to get done. And a day and a half later, it'd be like, here it is, it's done. What's next?
Yeah, that's great. And you were gung-ho about it too. It sounds like you enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, it was a great experience, and it was very much like, while I was still not, fully formed or anything, walking into that place and interacting there and being around that, for the full working day, that was a very comfortable environment for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Dwayne McDuffie, as some people may know, is that he worked on Milestone at comics at DC. Yep. And he did some animation. He's written Justice League, unlimited episodes and things. Do you have any particular anecdote about Dwayne McDuffie at all, about working with him?
Shoot, I mean, it's hard for me to find the one anecdote. Obviously, I worked under him as an intern, and I worked alongside him as an editor, and ultimately I edited books. He worked on Deathlock for me, and then years later did Beyond and Fantastic Four and a bunch of stuff. And Dwayne was great. He was possibly the smartest person that was up there at the time. But he wasn't.
He comes off as like he knows his continuity. He knows his universes. He loves the material. Is that how it came out to you?
Not even so much, in terms of knowing the continuity. Like, he knew the science. He knew the stuff behind it. He'd had a diverse career. He'd done a bunch of stuff. He'd written jokes for David Letterman. He'd had a background in physics. And he had a very affable personality. So it was very easy to sit and talk with him or eat lunch and whatnot. He would always eat, and I'm hardly one to talk. He would always eat the worst lunches. Lunch for Dwayne would be a box of Entenmann's cookies and a glass of milk. But we would do ridiculous things like, there was one day when, he'd gotten his hands on an egg's worth of silly putty, and he decided we were going to test silly putty on all of the various formats that we now produced to determine which the silly putty could still take an impression of the ink off of, and which it no longer could. And most of them were a failure. The printing had gotten good enough and sophisticated enough that you no longer could take it off with silly putty. But we performed that exacting scientific experiment for the good of mankind one lunchtime, in the summer of 1989. Yeah,
that's awesome. So now, 1989, also Revlon and the Perelman Group, they took over Marvel that year. Were you did you make any notices that corporate-wise things were different on a functional basis when that happened?
It's kind of hard to starting. It's kind of hard to say because there's no contrast. The big change that had happened before I got there was that Jim Shooter was out and Tom DeFalco was in. Mm-hmm. And even though I walked in 1989 and that had happened at the beginning of 87, 2 years earlier, it was still a thing that hung over that place.
Really?
Like nothing. Yeah. I don't. Again, I've had only infrequent and not terribly deep interactions with Jim over the years.
Yeah.
And they've all been reasonably pleasant. For all that, we've never been able to get things to work out where, he would write a book for me or whatnot. But in the Marvel of 1989, even people who couldn't stand one another on staff would come together in unity to agree that Jim Shooter was an enormous monster and it was a good thing that he wasn't there anymore. It was, wow. It's stunning. So the morale situation at Marvel in 1987 or the very end of 86 really had to be awful for it to still reverberate 2 years later. So that I can say for sure. The stuff I remember about Revlon coming in is not so much them coming in, but eventually, within a year or so of my being there, they were going to make the first stock offering. And they offered us, shares of the stock. You could buy in at, I think, $16 a share. But you had to buy a minimum of $25, and that was like $400. And I didn't have $400 to spare. I was working on an assistant editor's salary. I was making maybe $16.5 a year. So I didn't do it. And literally the moment the stock listed, it was already up at 19. And then it climbed, and then it split, and then it split again. And some people, if they were able to get out at the right point, made a ridiculous amount of money.
Wow.
But generally, I didn't see any of that. What was going on at Marvel at that time really was the marketplace was exploding in a big way. That was the era of, what we now think of as the big image creators. But in those days, it was just, Todd McFarlane, the guy that draws Spider-Man, and
those guys at that point.
Then Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, and those guys coming in and getting hotter and hotter, and these big sales happening to all these big books, and everything selling well and selling better.
There was a time when it was booming for sure.
Yeah, it was definitely a boom time there for the first couple of years.
Yeah. So then, how was Tom DeFalco as editor-in-chief?
Tom DeFalco as editor-in-chief, I think, was pretty good. Again, my perspective on Tom has changed over time because coming in, I was a little pissant assistant editor, and he was the editor-in-chief, and he intimidated the shit out of me. And not necessarily deliberately. And it's funny because over the years, I've found myself doing the same kind of thing, and I have to remind myself when I'm dealing with younger editors, they don't have the context for this. But Tom had come up in the ranks. Tom was of the editorial staff of that time.
Yes.
And so Tom had a very comfortable and very friendly relationship with all of the editors that were now theoretically under him.
Yes.
And now that Jim was gone and Tom was in charge, it was like this cloud had lifted. And so there was a lot of playfulness, there was a lot of joking around, and there was a lot of squeezing of shoes. But as somebody coming in, you didn't have that relationship and you didn't understand that relationship. And Tom would every once in a while delight in winding somebody up.
Yes.
And that was fine if you understood. He's just Tom DeFalco, that guy that used to work on the row, not really looking to do that. But if you don't have that context, he's a scary guy.
Interesting. Yeah. So because he's just doing business, but maybe there was just something about that and his position that it felt intimidating.
Well, the story that I tell, and it didn't happen to me, it happened to Eric Fine, who was the assistant editor, eventually associate editor, who ended up being hired because I didn't take the Danny Fingeroth position. He worked with Danny on the Spidey books, and when Carnage debuted in the Spider-Man titles, and that was a huge thing. It sold out a couple of printings and whatnot, and they rushed to do and it was very rare that they would do it in those days, like a little mini trade paperback of all the Carnage stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And Eric was assigned to put that together. And so he did, and he packaged it, sent it off to print, and eventually weeks go by, and Eric's sitting in his office working, and Tom DeFalco appears in his doorway and bellows at him, "Fine!" And Eric looks up, and Eric was kind of a jittery guy to begin with.
Yeah.
So he looks up and he's like, the editor-in-chief is in my doorway, and he's bellowing loudly. And Tom's got a copy of the Carnage book in his hand, and he holds it up and he shakes it. "What do you call this?" And Eric starts to stammer and goes, "It's the collection of the..." And Tom walks into the office and he throws it down on the desk. "What do you call that?" "I don't know. You know what I call that? I call that a goddamn perfect trade paperback." And Tom walks out. And Tom just thinks he's given the guy a compliment, and he's doing a little bit of theater. But I swear, for the rest of the day, Eric walked around,
scared,
jittering.
Yeah.
And it was all because, like, Tom, would lose sight of the fact that people looked at him or saw him in that way. He's actually a wonderful individual and a super good guy. Yeah. And again, once he was out as editor-in-chief and just working as a writer and so forth, like he wrote a bunch of stuff that I edited, and we worked together a lot. And that was a point at which we could actually connect as people.
As people, yeah.
But before that, he just had this ambiance and this way about him that he could be intimidating.
Nice. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess timing and position. So tell us, do you have any interactions about Mark Gruenwald you can tell us about? Because I'm a big Mark Gruenwald fan. I loved his Quasar and all that.
Sure. Well, Mark, again, I don't know that I have like the best stories.
The best story. No, that's okay.
Other people will have much better stories than I do, but what I tell people about Mark, because at this point he's been gone long enough that really nobody is left, one or two of us that even had any interaction with him. But the best analogy that I could give people in terms of understanding what he was like is that he was like Jim Henson.
Yeah, I like that.
He had that sort of personality, there's a sort of Midwestern center to him, but there's also a zaniness and a craziness and an appreciation for a certain type of chaos, and yet also very organization-based, very, very solid. So on the one hand, Mark would build the handbook to the Marvel Universe and attempt to quantify in exacting detail every aspect of every bit of this fictional universe and be very dedicated and focused on that as an objective. And on the other hand, he would fill his office, literally waist high with crumpled up copies of Return New Universe comics. He famously, I mean, there were a couple of big things he did. Michelle Marsh Day was one. He in his office one weekend, he and his assistants built a platform and put the desks on a platform. It was literally like a platform stage. And in theory, the reason that they did this was Jim Shooter was a big, tall guy, and so he was intimidating. He'd always be looking down on you.
Right.
But if Jim came in, it was the one office where Jim would actually have to look up. But that's not the whole of it. The real secret is that the platform had a trap door, and you could go down inside of it. And inside of it, there was a little man cave. Oh. And the little man cave, had like a place to sleep and a little black and white television and so forth. And what they would do, because the amount of work that was necessary to do the handbook every month was so extensive, particularly when you come down to typesetting in a pre-computer era and paste up and so forth, is they would have guys stay the whole weekend, in the office doing this. And at a certain point at night, a certain time at night, the building would close and like the motion sensors would go on and so forth. And before that would happen, you'd do your last bathroom run and you'd climb into the bunker.
Mm-hmm.
And you just be in there with your little mini fridge and your TV and your stuff and sleep for however many hours while the motion detectors were on. And eventually the next morning you could get up, go out. You could maybe sneak into Terry Stewart's office where there was a shower, and then go back, about the business of putting this thing out. All completely against building regulations and certainly Marvel regulations. But, it was one of these things that was a secret known to very few.
Wow, that's cool.
The few that worked on it.
Yeah.
Mark did stuff like that all the time. He really was the unofficial morale officer for Marvel in that generation. Everybody kind of liked him. He organized all of the holiday parties and outings, and he was big on games, and he was big on participation, which I didn't dig so much because I was not big on participation. But I regret that a little bit in hindsight. Somebody recently put up footage from I think it was like a 1991 or 1992 Halloween party, and I'm in it for like 2 seconds. Like I walked through at one point.
Yeah.
But everybody else is there and having a good time and goofing around and being silly. And I can look back at that and go, yeah, maybe I should have done more of that and less of whatever it was I was doing that day.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Now, there's some other details. You were there when Walt Simonson was kind of working on X Factor and then Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
John Jr. was there. John Romita Sr. Virginia Romita, his wife was there. She was running the bullpen.
Yeah.
Any stories about the Romitas and the bullpen?
Well, I mean, the Romitas were terrific. John in particular was great. And was wonderful both to learn things from. You would always learn stuff dealing with John, because John was both an absolute perfectionist and absolutely uncertain about his own abilities.
Yeah, he sounds like that in his interviews. He's always like saying something bad about his own stuff. I'm like, why?
Yeah. He's got a lot of humility about what he does, which is sort of ironic given the immense amount of talent that he has. I got to put together when he and Virginia retired in '96. We did an Art of John Romita book, and I got to prowl through his files and pull together all the art and stuff for that, and so forth. But John was just a wonderful salt of the earth kind of guy. The first year I was there, I had a friend who was a huge John Romita fan. And so there was a New York convention. And John was going to be there, and he sent me his sketchbook and said, could you get John to do like a drawing of the Green Goblin in my sketchbook? And so I went to the convention that weekend, and John's at whatever table he's at, and I stood in line, and I got up to the front of the line, and John looks up at me and is like, "Kid, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I came this thing, I got this, this sketch I wanted to get done." And John's like, "You don't got to do this here. Bring it to me on Monday. I'll do it in the office." And I was like, I don't want to, I don't want to trouble you. I don't want to. And he's like, no, we're not, you come back, you see me, bring it to me Monday. And so, I got out of line. I went down to his corner office on Monday, gave him the book, and, whatever, day later, beautiful Green Goblin from my buddy
Wow.
that I could send to him. He was just a really, a really good guy. Virginia too was, she was sort of like the mother matron of the bullpen, although she was much more of a hard ass. You could tell that within the family, she was the matriarch, and she was the one that made the trains run.
Yes.
And so every week we would have scheduling meetings, which came to be, colloquially known as the Virginia meeting, where Virginia would, all the editors would be there, and she would go over the schedule and see where things were and shake people down to make sure that books were running on time. And if they weren't, you caught a little hell for it. And so, again, Virginia could be very intimidating in that scenario.
Yeah.
She was actually a very lovely person. And she oversaw the bullpen and was great there. And it was nice having everybody kind of in-house. It was like a family business.
Yeah.
But she was definitely more of an ass kicker. than John was.
So that family vibe, that kind of changed then when Marvel went public in '91, right? Like, did that kind of changes some things, didn't it? Other than the stock stuff you were talking about.
I mean, the only real effects it had on Marvel internally, one, there was massive growth. You know, that the number of editors and the number of books we were putting out
was a lot.
got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because we were constantly chasing last year's sales figures. It's a thing that happened a couple of times over the years. DeFalco talks about it quite a lot. That the first year that they came in, Marvel put out Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1, and it sold like 1.5 million copies.
Yeah.
And at the end of that year, when it came time to do the next year's budget, the higher ups said to Tom, "Okay, you did great. Now do it again, but more."
Yeah.
And Tom came downstairs and went, "I don't know how the heck we're going to match."
Yeah, that knows numbers because they're kind of unprecedented. Yeah.
But how we're going to match the sales of Spider-Man #1, and they talked about it, and they said, well, maybe if we do X-Men #1 and we relaunch New Mutants as X-Force #1 at the same time, maybe between the two we can just eke over the line. Yes. And then it turned out that X-Force sold 4 million copies, and X-Men sold 8 million copies.
Start of the whole thing. Yeah.
And then at the end of that year, they said to Tom, "You did great. Now do it again, but more." And Tom came downstairs and went, "How the heck are we going to do this?" And the answer there was lines. And that was the year that we launched Midnight Suns, and the year that we launched 2099. And I think there was an Epic launch line in there. I forget whether it was Heavy Hitters or one of the earlier ones. And through all of that, like for 3 or 4 iterations, Marvel and under Tom was able to meet those goals.
Yes.
But it was an ever-expanding sort of house of cards that inevitably was going to fall in on itself at a certain point. You can't sustain that growth forever. And when it happened pretty much all at once.
Yeah, pretty hard. So then, so that's interesting. So it's more like the corporate expectations on Tom is the change when it goes public, and the Revlon people are kind of calling the shots. So then there were a couple changes that happened. And what was your viewpoint? So Chris Claremont and Louis Simonson seemed like they were kind of replaced creatively on their titles of X-Men and New Mutants by even the writing direction by Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld. I think Bob Harris did that. When you were seeing that, were you like, okay, cool, that's a good change, or or it's going to speak to the new generation, or were you like, well, I don't know, or were you really not involved in it? And you didn't have an opinion of it whatsoever?
I wasn't really involved because, again, Bob was editing the X-Men books. He was the line editor of X-Men at that point and had been for a number of years. I think I must have been on a certain level surprised that Chris was out. But, you have to also remember that for years at that point, the hardcore fandom had been saying, Chris is tired, Chris is done, you got to get him out of here. We need somebody new there. And it wasn't necessarily the whole of that audience, because X-Men still sold like crazy, and people really loved what Chris was doing. Absolutely. But the vocal segment of fandom for years, had been saying, "Oh no, he's no good anymore." And so on that level, the fact that it happened wasn't to me like, "Oh, the earth has shook." It was just, okay, he's whatever. Bob is making a choice. He's going in this direction. And with Louise on New Mutants and X Factor, it was kind of the same sort of thing. Like Louise had come in on those books at a certain point. She inherited New Mutants, I think, from Chris, and she inherited X Factor from Bob Layton. And so her going out, it was just, it was business as usual. Okay, somebody's run is ending, somebody new is coming in. There was an overall, chase of the sales figures that was going on.
That's really the thing. Yeah.
I can remember, because the other part of this that people either don't realize or don't remember so often is, during that period, and starting, to his credit with Jim Shooter, the editors got incentives as well as the talent did. So, it was proportionally a much smaller slice. But if your book did well, that resulted in actual dollars in your pocket as an editor.
Right.
And so, particularly as this chase for sales went on, and people started to get bigger and bigger checks as a result, the expectation and the sense of proportion got all out of whack. I can remember editors complaining because their book had only sold 500,000 copies and feeling like they'd somehow been screwed, or the book hadn't been promoted well enough, or whatever the hell, for 500,000 copies, which is bananas. But all the sense of scale was out the window. Yes. And that 500,000 copies, that was whatever, $3-4 grand in that guy's pocket. But if it had been 600,000 copies, maybe it would have been $6-7 grand or whatever. And so people were legitimately thinking about that way, in that mercenary a fashion.
There you go. That it definitely explains that culture shift at Marvel at that time. So then, were you surprised then when the image revolution happened and the creators that were creating all this money for the company, they just said, we'll just create it for ourselves somewhere else?
I certainly everybody was shocked that it happened, because nobody really saw it coming that way, and it hadn't been done before. By the same token, I came out of the generation who, the direct market wasn't a new thing for me. It all kind of evolved and became a thing right at the point that I was reading those books. Mm-hmm. And I read a lot of independent, comics in those days. Independent, whether that meant, a First or an Eclipse, or whether that meant, an Aardvark Vanaheim, or an ElfQuest. So I had a pretty good understanding of that world. And so the idea that these guys would go out and do their own thing, it wasn't alien to me. I think what was surprising both to me and to everybody else was that it was as enormously successful as it was. And I think the other part of that is, I think everybody was a little taken aback by the fact that, and this should not have been surprising to anyone. It's just nobody had done it before. Mm-hmm. The books that they went off and did effectively felt like, they were quasi Marvel books. Like they were very much straight ahead, right down the middle superhero titles of one sort or another.
Yes.
Wildcats wasn't X-Men, but it was a superhero team the likes of which you could have found at a Marvel or DC. Yeah. And Savage Dragon wasn't the Hulk, but you could see that character existing in a Marvel line or a DC line. So in effect, what those guys did, at least at the outset, was to do the same sort of material they had been doing at Marvel and really tap into and connect with the audience that had come to really, love what they did on those older characters, and make that transition to these new characters. It really felt, I think, to a lot of younger readers at that point, like this is the beginning of the new Marvel. I wasn't around when Amazing Fantasy 15 came out, but I've got my copy of Shadowhawk #1, and it's going to be like Amazing Fantasy 15 when I'm a 40-year-old man, because people are going to look back and I was there when that happened. Yeah, I think it was a huge thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I like Shadowhawk, but they don't make Shadowhawks as much anymore. Jim Valentino's not really drawing stuff, so it becomes one of those things that comes and goes, really. So then that's interesting. So then the trading card and hologram cover zeitgeist of the time, was that just kind of, who would you say kind of came up with that or pushed that the most?
Well, there's two pieces to that. Trading cards were kind of a separate thing.
Yeah.
One of the first things that I worked on when I came in, working with Bob Budiansky, was the first line of Marvel trading cards, the 1990 Impel set.
Right.
And that was a licensing deal like any other, and in our special projects area was a thing that we handled. So creatively, Bob and to a lesser extent I, as the assistant, put those cards together. And in fact, I wrote probably a quarter of that set.
Oh, you did? That's awesome.
Yeah.
I got those when they came out. That's great.
And that first set, there was an expectation for it, but it performed way better than anybody anticipated. And so, we ended up doing the second year set and then beginning to expand out from there and going, well, what else, could we do? And we did the X-Men set, and we did the first Marvel Masterpieces set, and we did the Spider-Man set. And, that became more and more successful to the point where, one of the things that was going on with Revlon and Marvel is they were on a buying frenzy. They were ill capitalized, and they were using a lot of Marvel equity as collateral in a lot of purchases in trying to stay ahead of their debt, which is ultimately what sent everything into bankruptcy, because you couldn't generate enough money to stay ahead of the curve long enough. But at the time, they were on a buying frenzy, and they bought Fleer. They bought the trading card company Fleer, and their thought was, well, we have this licensing deal with Impel, which became Skybox, but if we do it through Fleer, we get to keep all the money. And so they did that, and then people came in along with Fleer, and that became a bit of a battle for control, and ultimately they ended up taking over the cards, and then eventually that whole market kind of collapsed and crumbled.
Crashed,
so that was a separate thing. Enhanced covers came about slightly accidentally.
Yeah.
There'd been a little bit of evidence beforehand, like there'd been 2 covers on Man of Steel #1, and the first issue of Legends of the Dark Knight, they had shipped out with 4 sort of cardboardy outer covers that were different colors. But what I think of as the first real cover enhancement was an issue of Hulk. It was the Peter David Dale Keown Hulk. It was the issue in which Peter integrated the various Hulk personalities into the one, unified Hulk.
Yeah, Professor Hulk. Yeah.
Yeah, the Professor Hulk. And they, they did this cover where they printed it with a 5th color ink, a fluorescent green ink, and that was an ink that wasn't normally used on a cover. You had to pay for it special, and they put that book out, and it sold like crazy, and they had to do second printings and things. And so that, plus the fact that we also had a trading card division where in every set of cards you would do chase cards, and the point of chase cards was they're harder to get, you got to buy more packs to get them all, and they're a driver. And part of what made them unique was they'd almost all revolve around some bit of technology. They'd be holographic, they'd have foil, they'd be 3-dimensional, they'd have some gimmick that the trading card companies had figured out how to manufacture. And so applying that thought process to comics, people began to be able to experiment with covers. They did the glow-in-the-dark Ghost Rider cover, which is still a great cover and a great idea. It's just Ghost Rider's head on fire, and it glows in the dark. That's super cool.
Yeah.
But every time they did it, those books sold like crazy.
Right.
And consequently, particularly as the need to make that nut continued to elevate, it went from being, we'll do one of these every once in a while, to we're going to do one of these every month, to we got to do 2 of them every month, to now you got to do 3 of them every month.
Yeah.
And not only were there not enough enhancements, like you ran out of stuff you could do, and you were trying to come up with the weirdest thing. There are some covers done in that period that are bananas. They don't make any sense at all, and they look awful because nobody had actually cracked whatever that technology is or figured out how to use it effectively, but it had to be done. So let's
make it happen. This sounds like the Gorilla cover directive by Erwin Donenfeld at DC in like the 60s, right? Doesn't that feel similar?
Sort of. Although it's kind of the opposite there. Like Erwin had figured out that gorillas were a thing that tended to spike sales. And in fact, at a certain point, he put the brakes on it, and we're not going to have any more than 1 gorilla cover in a month, because as people found, learned of this, or as he excitedly told editors about this, they immediately went, I better put a bunch of gorillas on my covers. That's going to help me sell comics. And ultimately, Irwin was the guy that said, okay, enough. We're going to kill the golden goose. Only 1 of these a month from now on.
There you go. And then, whereas Marvel was like, let's quadruple this and let's go for it.
Well, yes, but again, that was all in service of the demands from higher up. If you need to do better than your record-breaking year last year by X percent, 10%, 20%, and you don't even know how you're going to match it, you were literally just throwing everything you can think of,
whatever tool you had. Yeah. So then, when the 1994 Heroes World distribution debacle happened, and Marvel says, we're going to go with our own distributor, there's a whole collapse of the distributors. the Heroes World distributors couldn't really handle all that product moving around, and then Marvel ends up going with Diamond. Diamond becomes kind of the, I don't know if monopoly is the right word, but it does. When you were going through all this, it was like all this like rise and almost like fall, the image revolution's happening, all this craziness. What's going through your head? And were you still doing special projects at this time? And were you like, okay, this might fall apart soon?
Well, again, you're talking about a lot of events over a decent amount of time.
Right.
So to kind of try to walk through it, eventually two things happened. One was Fleer came in, and Fleer ended up absorbing the trading card. As trading cards as a segment became larger and larger, it became more and more of what Bob Budiansky and I were focused on. And so other stuff that was typically done by special projects ended up being outsourced to other editors in other places, movie adaptations and so forth, even posters, I think, by the end of it. So then the next thing that happened is the thing that ended up being called Marvelcution, which is at a certain point, the business guys got fed up with Tom DeFalco always telling them no for all of their great harebrained ideas that were sure to bring ruin to the world, including things like Heroes World. And so they decided we're gonna promote him, laterally out of the way, and we're gonna break up the editorial division into 5 subdivisions, each one of which will have an editor-in-chief. That will prevent the editor-in-chief position from being too powerful in any given set of hands, and allow our sales department to really drive the bus. And in that process, because that was all happening at around the time that the trading cards were going away, Bob Budiansky was put in charge of the Spider-Man segment of Marvel. He was the editor-in-chief of Spider-Man during that year, which certainly was aggravating to Danny Fingeroth, who had been the senior editor on Spider-Man, had been editing the Spidey books, all the way through, at least up to the point where Jim Salicrup had left a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
And he and Bob, they'd known each other back in college and so forth, and they always had a certain amount of almost like a rivalry relationship.
Oh, okay.
And so this was kind of a bad mojo situation. But I then segued myself, and my assistant at the time, Glenn Greenberg, segued into working in the Spidey area. That having been said, that lasted a year. And for that year, it was the worst year of the brakes are off of, we need more blood out of the stone. We need more. And I tell this story as to the younger editors as a cautionary tale too, because when the 5 editor-in-chiefs were set up, each one was given a goal. Bob Harris's goal was to grow X-Men by 20%. Bob Budiansky's goal was to grow Spider-Man by 10%. And then Mark Gruenwald, Bobby Chase, and Carl Potts, who did the Marvel Heroes, was called Marvel Edge, but was kind of, Ghost Rider and Friends. And then the Epic line, all 3 of them didn't have to grow at all. They just had to stay level. They couldn't lose anything over the course of that next year. The only one of the 5 that actually achieved that goal was Bob Budiansky. And he was subsequently fired for it.
And what year was that?
That would have been, I'm going to say 95.
Okay. So is this like Spidey Clone Saga era then?
Yes. Yeah. The Clone Saga had started,
okay.
and was going, and was about to reach a certain level of resolution. And part of the reason it never did for the longest time was the sales guys were saying, this is going too well, it's selling too good, keep it going. You got to keep it going, and you got to do more. And what other Spidey books can you do, and how can you expand the line? 10% more. We need 10% more.
Yes.
And so that was the driving force. And Buddha did it honestly by strip mining the Spider-Man world. He dug deep into the bedrock there, and I don't know if there had been if he'd had to do it for a second year or a third year, if it would be able to have been able to be continued. But he was very effective at being able to do that, even though in trying to do that, he drove everybody absolutely crazy.
Right.
But that was the mission that was set down by the company, and so that was what he had to try to do.
I see.
Like it or not. in the aftermath of that was what we called Marvelcution, which is when, by this point they even the ownership of the company, my sense of the timing of this gets a little muddled in my head.
Yeah.
But there was already beginning to be fights over control of the company, because these debts that had been accumulated were building up, and people were buying the debt in the hopes of staging a hostile takeover and so forth. And so at a certain point, the powers that be of that day decided, nope, no more 5 editor-in-chiefs. We're going to go with one editor-in-chief. It's going to be Bob Harras. And we have, the market is crashing. We need to cut costs. We are going to fire tons of people.
Yes.
And pretty much, a third to a half of the staff were all laid off in that, whatever it was, January 6th.
That's around the time when like Gruenwald had a heart attack and stuff.
It's a little after that.
Yeah.
But it's all, from this point of view, it's all about the same time.
It's all around the same time. How did you survive the culling?
It's on one level, it's a mystery, and I've talked to people about this over the years. And Jim Sokolowski, who was at that time the publisher, told me at one point that in the end it came down to a choice between me and Joey Cavalieri, and they figured that I would be more of a team player.
Okay.
My interpretation of that is that it came down to me and Joey was making more money than I was. And so he was probably a better savings than I was.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, like literally everybody else that was a part of that Spider-Man team was killed all around me.
Yeah.
And myself and Glenn, my assistant, were the only ones that survived it.
This is like a Roy Thomas what if ending already.
Yes. It was and this whole period, and for the next 5 years, as we descended into the point where Marvel went into bankruptcy, and control of the company, who was overseeing it, who was running it, and what its goals and objectives were, would change on almost a week-to-week basis. You'd come in on a Monday, and some guy you'd never seen before would walk into the center of the bullpen and go, "All right, listen up. I'm the new president, and I'm here now, and now we're going to do things the right way, and we're going to dig our way out of this, and we're going to." And he'd have a bunch of things that he'd want to do, and then the next week another guy would come in, and everything
like a newspaper strip.
Yeah, and everything he would tell you would be completely the opposite of what the last guy did. So it was absolute chaos.
Yeah.
And not a terribly.
Were you thinking like, man, this place is going down the drain? I mean, what were you feeling about the place, or were you just saying, hey, I'm just glad to still be here?
I think it was more that, and it was much more focused on, there's no other thing you can do but walk forward. There's no other thing you can do but keep going.
Yeah, you were a good soldier through the whole thing, it sounds like.
I had to, because Bob Budiansky was really like my touch point and my mentor coming in.
Yeah.
And he was gone, and I had no particular relationship with Bob Harras. Other than I guest starred the X-Men in some comics, and Bob had not liked the depiction in the end at some point. So I had no relation. I had no support structure at all after that was gone. It was just me. I was all that was left, and so I had to figure out how to do that, and how to prove my value and my worth, actively. And that's really I think the point where. It's not like I didn't have some editorial skills or some acumen or whatever before that, but that's really the point where, I became or started to become the Tom Brevoort that I am now.
Yes.
Because there was no other option. Your back was against the wall, and you were still here. They were still paying you. You were still employed. You want to still be employed. You still want to do this. Lots of other people, went out and looked for other jobs and other things. And every once in a while, I would talk to somebody or I would entertain something, but I'd never actually really act on it because I wanted to be at Marvel. This is what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so my attitude was always just, you just got to keep slugging, got to keep plugging on, got to do more. And that very quickly, turned into my philosophy of, I am going to do twice as much as any other person, because my thinking was, if they're going to get rid of me, they're going to need at least 2 guys to replace me. And it almost doesn't matter what they're paying me. It's going to be cheaper for it to be me than it is for anybody else. And so, I in those days I set records in terms of the amount of stuff that you would do. On the org chart of the day, an editorial workload was 5 monthly titles, and then maybe a 6th special project in any given month. That was objectively the amount you were supposed to be doing. And there were months in there where I put out 15 books.
I see.
I would just, once I got ahead of steam, and once I started to figure out how to make the levers work a little bit, I got in tight with some of the guys that ran our P&Ls, and began to understand that process, and got to understand how to make something profitable, or where the lines were. And I would pitch any stupid project that came into my head that I thought was halfway decent, and I was pretty good at being able to understand that system well enough to go, well, if you do this and this and this, I can make the thing I want to make, and it will make money. So you should let me do it because I want to do it. And for the most part, the answer that came back was, yeah, okay, you want to do it? We like making money. Go make money. Don't lose money. You're good. And so I did a lot of scrambling there, but it was not, by any metric, it was not a fun, pleasant time.
Right. It sounds like there was a lot of stress too. So
it's a huge period of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's the main word. So then in 1997, when ToyBiz bought Marvel, and then Perelmutter stabilized it financially, was that the feeling on the ground floor, like, okay, the nightmare's over? Or was there a thing like, okay, this might go nuts too? What was the overall vibe with that purchase?
No. Going into that, we didn't think too much about that purchase, I don't think, because that was just the latest scrimmage in a series of scrimmages.
There you go.
Probably the bigger turning point there was when Bob Harris got fired, and Joe Quesada came in as editor-in-chief. Joe had been around, Joe and Jimmy, as part of Marvel Knights, and Marvel Knights was another, during this period, we kind of skipped over Heroes Reborn.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that too, yes.
And Heroes Reborn was, again, the business folks upstairs saying, numbers are in the toilet everywhere. We can't seem to reverse this. When was the last time numbers were good? It was when these guys were doing the books. What if we offer them a deal where we license the characters to them?
To the image guys, basically, to do Marvel, yeah.
Yeah, Jim and Rob will license the characters there, and we'll make out. And they did that deal, and that deal in particular was hugely traumatic for Marvel editorial staff, because the 1-2 punch of that is you've just eliminated a third to a half of the staff, and now you're starting to outsource the characters. And that was definitely the feeling there was, oh, this is all done. Like, they're going to shut this place down.
Who originated that idea? Are you able to say?
It wasn't anybody in editorial. It was all above.
It was all corporate stuff. Okay.
Yeah, or higher ups. I don't know exactly who. I'm sure Rob Liefeld just did a bunch of podcasts about this recently, like over the last couple of weeks. I haven't listened to any of them, frankly, because while I'm innately curious, I'm also sure they'll aggravate the hell out of me. I've kind of stayed away from them. But I bet he talks chapter and verse about who it was that contacted him and Jim and what the deal was and so forth. But there was a whole that was a whole process, and that was enormously scary. That was the point at which it was entirely not even possible, but likely that Marvel was just going to be broken up and sold as parts, and somebody would buy Spider-Man and somebody would buy the Hulk.
That's what it kind of feels like. Yeah, like you're licensing out the stuff. Yeah.
Right, and ultimately for a myriad of reasons, including shifting people at the top and so forth. And again, my understanding is Rob goes into this in complete depth, and while having not heard it, I can't vouch for his account. He at least was there, so he's probably got some good insight. By the end of a year, this was kind of done. But the idea of it perpetuated. And so Marvel Knights was kind of the second attempt at doing this.
I see. Okay, so that's like a reaction to is Heroes Reborn seen as a successful endeavor?
I guess it depends on, do you mean at the time? Do you mean in
at the time, aftermath? As far as like sales, and did it work?
On the most basic level, those opening issues sold as well as those books have ever sold. Rob has continually pointed out the fact, and he's not wrong, that his Avengers #1 is the best-selling issue of Avengers ever. And he's right about that. I've edited Avengers now for like 20 some odd years, and I've never put an issue out that's sold as well as his Avengers 1.
Yeah.
His Cap, Jim's FF, and Jim's overseen Iron Man, those books all sold very well. That having been said, they also cost a lot more to produce.
There you go.
Because of the deals involved and so forth. And I don't know enough about the finances there to really get into it. At a certain point, for whatever reason, and again, it may have even been just a shift in who was at the top and what the goals were. Somebody decided they didn't like the deal and wanted to renegotiate the terms. And there was some question about delivery, and there was some question about characters. Rob literally this weekend put up this drawing he had done of a piece for an upcoming Captain America issue that was going to feature Daredevil. And I remember that being a huge problem at the time, because when the Heroes Reborn deal was made, those guys had access to only a certain list of characters, and Daredevil wasn't on that list. Marvel Central was still publishing a Daredevil book at that point, and so the idea that suddenly that character was going to be showing up in issues of Captain America sent people spinning wildly. Whether that was something that Rob just did on his own, or whether that was something that Rob had talked to somebody up the chain at Marvel about, I can't speak to that. But definitely that deal became problematic. Rob butted heads with whomever. He left. He got out, fairly quickly. Jim stuck around for the whole of the year, and did the year, and eventually all those titles and things, folded back into Marvel editorial.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it was successful on a certain level. It popped the numbers. It re-energized interest in those characters and things.
Yeah.
Creatively, was it successful? Again, I don't know. There's certainly, and you see it now. There's certainly a generation that grew up with those books coming out.
Yeah.
That were really excited by.
Yeah. Right. If it hits you at that age, then you found love. Yeah.
Yeah. And in the history of Marvel, there've been some stuff that's been pulled out of it, and there've been some things that have been used and gone on to be other stuff, but it's not like it casts that huge of a shadow.
Right. So now Bill Jemas, or am I saying it right? Jemas? Jemas.
Bill Jemas.
Bill Jemas. So tell us about working with Bill Jemas, because honestly, I kind of like the stuff that he was kind of doing at the time. He was kind of a nutty guy. How was working with him in comparison to Joe Quesada as editor-in-chief in the late 90s?
Well, again, Bill and there is no differentiation. Bill and Joe came in more or less together.
Right.
Bill was there first, and Bill had been there before. Like the one, if I had any advantage at all during that time, it was that Bill had first worked for Marvel because he came in with Fleer. Bill was the person specifically who took over trading cards and took them away from Budiansky and myself.
Yes.
So I had history with Bill.
Yes.
Even before he came back, and so my analysis of Bill is very personal and perhaps very slanted, and I try to be even-handed about it. I really do, because the plain fact of the matter is, Bill is a very smart, very sharp guy. He knows a lot about a lot. And when he's in a good functioning mode, he was very good at cutting through a lot of the red tape and BS that built up around the field, and was very good at saying why not in cases where something was an institutionalized belief or policy, that you don't do this or you can't do that. Well, why not? We have to submit our stuff to the Comics Code, or we can't publish it. Well, why not? And so he was excellent at that. He definitely had an interest in the comic book medium and the comic book field.
Yes.
And he's shown that even since leaving Marvel, where he's had a number of different ventures that have been comics related. There's something about this process and this field that speaks to him. and he could be sometimes like a generous and reasonable cat, but he was a fucking monster, and a bully and a tyrant and mercurial, and he created a work environment that was as bad as I can imagine it being. We talked at the outset of this, at least for me. Other people may feel differently. Certainly other people got along with him better or worse. I don't want to speak for, a Joe Quesada or an Axel Alonso or anybody else who might have been up there, Bobby Chase. I can only speak for myself. We spoke a while back about the Jim Shooter era.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that was like. I didn't experience it. I wasn't there. But the closest I can parallel it to was when those couple of years when Bill was running Marvel. There was an analogy that Joe used, and I will credit it to him, although I don't want to cast. I'm saying this so take this as coming from me. That what Bill was really good at is if you had like a classic car, and if you think of Marvel as like a classic car that it's been on the road for a while, it's kind of worn down, and he's going to refurbish it. He's going to restore it and polish it up and put it back and make it shine again. Bill was great at doing that, and he did it. But then he wouldn't stop, and he kept polishing, and he polished, and he polished, and he polished his way through the hood, and polished his way down into the engine, and started to polish all the bits off of the engine until what was left was a wreck. Like, he couldn't stop at a certain point. There was a point where you just don't need to be pushing in that same way, and Bill was constantly pushing in that same way.
Right. So it's like a proctology appointment gone wrong.
I'll leave that part to your imagination, but
Okay, so when you say he was a monster, because I have one more question after the monster part.
Yeah.
And then Jim's gonna take over on the 2000s. Is give me one example of your interaction with him that was monstrous.
I'll give you one. It's not directly mine, although I was a part of it. One of Bill's theories at a certain point was that comic book covers should be more like magazine covers.
Okay.
And this started out, one of the things that would happen with Bill is what I tend to think of as sort of like mission drift. When he started out, what he was reacting to is we'd done a lot of covers that were like fight covers. Here's the Avengers fighting the Lethal Legion, and there's 70 figures, and they're all tiny, and they're all fighting. And Bill liked very simple, straightforward covers. You can kind of see this if you look at all the early Ultimate Universe covers. They're all just, here's Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Here's Spider-Man. Spider-Man's on the package. That's what you're getting. So he wanted there to just be single figure covers. Past a certain point, though, he got more attracted to the notion of bad girl comics. And so that mission tended to drift towards, we want them to all be single character covers, and they should be, effectively a porn actress bending over a Maserati.
Right. I remember that. I remember those covers very well, very clearly too. Yes.
If you look at any cover to Marvel past the first one, that's kind of what he was aiming for.
Yeah, that was his manifesto, right, Marvel?
I don't know if it was a manifesto. It started off as a gag challenge that kind of grew into something else as it went. Yeah. It's sort of a fascinating study. I don't know if it's a great comic, but it's a fascinating sort of character study if you can dig through it all. But anyway, this was the thing, and in fact, there was a meeting at which Bill was unhappy with the covers, and he brought in a stack of comics, and he proceeded to like throw them at people across the table because this is shit, this is awful, this is crap. And there was a new assistant editor, and I don't want to mention her name because why drag her into this after all this time? Who had started not that long ago, was very intelligent, was very promising, went on to be a significant young YA author, and she had a comic thrown at her, and it wanged off of her head.
Oh,
and
no.
she left the meeting, and she went to the HR department and went, I am done. I quit. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And then the HR department was like, this is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Bill, we need you to go and fix this. We need you to apologize to this woman and make sure this doesn't become a problem. And Bill apparently called her to his office to talk to her, and his opening line was reportedly, and I say reportedly, but I heard this from her, so I feel fairly confident in it. Don't be a dick.
No, that's horrible.
And that was just that just sort of sums up the kind of it was almost like a frattish persona.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Did she leave after that, or did she stay?
Oh yeah, she left. She was gone. It was sort of an Ivy League frattish persona.
Yes.
Bill was very he'd also come out of the NBA, so he was very basketball focused, which was weird. He'd always want to like take people out and play basketball with them and show you how great he was, even though I'm hardly a basketball player, but he was a middling player at best.
I see.
But he wanted to, like that was a part of his persona.
Okay.
And like Bill was always very effective in any room where he was the biggest guy. Again, when we talked about Tom DeFalco earlier, Tom was intimidating and didn't really realize he was intimidating because as much as anything, it was the position that made him intimidating. Bill could only function in a position where he had that authority. In a fair fight, that's a guy that would have been beaten up a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
By people because he was just such a prick in the way he interacted with human beings. And the only thing that kept him out of it was he was absolutely rock smart. And he was very savvy and he had connections and he knew how to make things happen. Like I don't want to uncredit him. He was phenomenally instrumental along with Joe. Without Joe, none of it would have worked because Joe creatively had the vision and had the insight that made that go. And so whenever Bill would have a crazy idea like, oh, we should restart Spider-Man, it was Joe who would go, hey, we should get this guy Brian Bendis to write it. And that was the piece that was almost more important than that initial idea.
Yeah.
Like that, Joe was the one that actually, I think, enabled all of that stuff to function. But it wasn't just Joe. It was Bill pushing against all of this stuff. And without him there, I don't know that you could have turned around that business in the way that it happened.
Bill and Joe Quesada together turned Marvel around.
Yeah. And it's proportional. And like I say, I try to be as even-handed with this as I can because there's personal feeling and there's professional feeling.
Yeah.
Even personally, like I don't have any particular ill will towards Bill. He's working on the new venture AWA right now. I'm following a bunch of those books that Axel is working on over there, and that's a very nice line, and I hope he's successful with it. I don't actually wish him any ill will. I don't necessarily want to hang out with him.
Right.
I don't want to necessarily.
No ill will, no ill Bill. Yeah.
The persona he would put on for the public, where he would do these weird wrestling style interviews and things, he would be like that internally sometimes too, and that's when things were the craziest.
I gotcha. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the double-edged sword with Shooter is I think financially he did turn Marvel around in the early in like 1980 or so, but then creatively there's a lot of crazy interpersonal things, and it's so it sounds like it's similar, like what you said.
Yeah, and again, going back to Jim, obviously I said some things earlier that can maybe be taken as unkind, but I wasn't there I can only report on what Marvel was like after him.
On what the other people said, yeah.
And there's no denying the fact that Jim did a lot of good in terms of getting creators incentives, in terms of building, reprint structures, hell, putting the editorial staff that structure that we still use today into place, and teaching a lot of people fundamentals about storytelling. I think Jim sometimes gets a little dogmatic about certain aspects of that, but that doesn't change the fact that a lot of that lesson was good and necessary. And while when I think of the Jim Shooter era as a reader, I feel like it became a less interesting time What I think he did was, there at any given point, there's the best comic you're putting out and the worst comic you're putting out, and that field is the distance. Everything else is between them. And so Jim maybe took the best comic down a little bit, but he raised the bottom comic up a lot. And so the whole of the line was a better line pound for pound than it was in the more Wild West days, where you'd occasionally get this, weird, miraculous jewel that, Steve Gerber or somebody did, but alongside something that was just, the worst kind of we're banging out 17 pages because we have a job to fill.
Yeah.
Kind of stories. He was very good at equalizing the line and bringing up the level of craft all across the Marvel titles.
Yep. All right. So last question, then Jim takes over, is in 1998, the Blade movie comes out. Do you feel like that basically starts off the movie saga of Marvel because that movie did well? And when you watched it, when it came out, were you like, wow, they could actually make movies out of these characters pretty well now? What was your take on that?
The Blade movie wasn't the one for me that made Marvel movies a thing. They did it obviously, but Blade had been at best an ancillary character at that point. He'd never even had a book of his own until right before that. He'd been in Night Stalkers, and he had been a player in Tomb of Dracula and had a couple of black and white magazine appearances and such. But he wasn't a big character. So the idea that you could take that and make a vampire movie out of it, it was great that it was a Marvel thing, and it was great that it did well, but that didn't translate in my head to, oh yeah, they're going to make a Spider-Man movie now. Like, that property by itself came out of, a certain sort of 70s blaxploitation Hammer film, monster thing that Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan tapped into in the 70s.
Yeah.
And, they were doing the 90s version of that. It was great. It was terrific that it was successful and so forth, but it wasn't the thing. The one that probably made it seem more like, oh yeah, you're going to get Marvel movies now is X-Men.
Yes.
Because X-Men was...
So that's really the beginning for you, yeah.
Yeah. And again, like so much of this stuff, you can look back and go, well, no, really, it was Blade. And it was. But at the time living it, that was just, that movie opened and it's great. It's a Marvel movie, but it's not like the beginning of stuff. I don't feel like I'm going to get Thor next week.
Yeah. Yeah. You would say it's more like a better version of Red Sonja rather than like the beginning of the Marvel Studios era. Yeah.
Yeah. It was an outlier. It was a weird thing. It was the equivalent of DC having a Swamp Thing movie in 1980.
Yeah.
Like, yep, that's great. That doesn't mean that we're going to be doing The Flash next year. It's that's very much on the outer edge of what we publish, and it's great that it got done, and it's great that it was successful, but it doesn't necessarily have an impact on like the core of this.
Yeah, I see.
Whereas once you got to X-Men, and you could do not only a superhero movie, but a team of superheroes, which is, again, we now take it for granted, but like that was a huge thing in
it's a big deal.
2000. Yeah. Like, you had half a dozen superheroes, all of whom had their own weirdo power, and all of whom were able to be explained and gotten across and emote and to do for all that. You look back at it now and it looks like such a tiny little movie in terms of its scale and in terms of its budget and all. Like, that seemed like a huge big thing in 2000.
Oh yeah. Bryan Singer did a great job with that.
And so from that you could kind of go, oh yeah, they really can make a movie of all this stuff. And then, following up on that was Spider-Man in 2002.
I'm not like a huge fan of the Heroes Reborn stuff. It was not my thing. What saved me in terms of loving Marvel, and this was the 90s, so I was really into Vertigo and DC at the time. Yep. I'm just a few years older than you are. And what saved me for Marvel was Kurt Busiek. that he was starting with Marvels with Alex Ross, but then you came to work with him with like the second or so issue of Night Thrasher.
Yeah. It was his Night Thrasher run was the first time we actually did a comic together. We had talked a bunch. He had been on staff when I started. He was in the sales department, and he was only there for maybe a year before he left and moved to Portland and became a full-time freelance writer. But he'd been on staff, and so we'd had conversations and things. And so I think there was, particularly on his end, there was an understanding that like I had a similar enough ethos to what he had that I would be a friendly port of call, so to speak.
Yes, I'm saying this as a compliment to you, that the two of you together, because Busiek was the one that in some ways gave highest career accolades, right? You won an Eisner for Best Editor.
No, I was nominated for.
You were nominated for Best Editor.
I was beaten by Dan Raspler for Kingdom Come.
Well, okay. So, but that was mainly in relation to Untold Tales of Spider-Man.
Yeah, at that time that would have been just about all that anybody was paying attention to. I was editing a lot of other stuff, but in terms of getting on an Eisner ballot, yeah, it would have been from that.
And then while in my mind, Heroes Reborn is destroying everything that I like about Marvel Comics. He saves it to some degree with Thunderbolts, and then in 1998, because you're talking about being associated with Avengers, he brings between Avengers Forever and Avengers with George Perez, he brings it back and saves it in a heroic way. And you were part of that as well, correct?
Yes, yeah, I edited all of those books that you just talked about.
And did you think that it needed saving? Was this something where you thought we're putting it back on track from where I wasn't necessarily going to go?
Yes and no, which is to say, at any given stage, my goal was always kind of the same thing. I just wanted to do, good comics, whatever I thought was a good comic, whatever comprised that. And so, going into Thunderbolts, it was an idea that Kurt had. He'd had it years before in another context for a pitch that never had worked out, called Avengers Hit Squad. And so with Heroes Reborn happening, we had a retreat, a writers and editors retreat, where all the editors and a couple of key writers were going to be gathering for 2 or 3 days to try and figure out what the heck do you do with the Marvel Universe and with the publishing line without all of the characters that are now going over to be as part of Heroes Reborn. And so, leading up to that, Kurt was still working on Untold Tales of Spider-Man with me, and he was coming to this retreat, and he called me up and said, I've got this idea, and he laid it out for me, and we talked about it a little bit over the phone. And then, he came to the retreat, and he and I, mostly he, pitched it to Bob Harris in the bar of the hotel where we were staying. And Bob went, okay, yep, well, let's do that. Let's go. And that wasn't so much about us going, we're gonna do the right thing, so much as this is a cool idea. There's an opportunity here. The timing is great. Let's do that. And then when the Heroes Reborn books came back for Heroes Return, it wasn't so much about now we're gonna fix them, so much as what it really was those books all sold really, really well under Jim and Rob and those guys. Even by the end of it, like they tapered off a little bit, but they were still super strong. So, the mission statement going into that thing was really, we got to show we can do these and make them perform just as well as the guys that were just shown the door.
Right.
And so everybody, not just, myself or Kurt, but everybody involved, in all of those launches was very much dedicated to, we got to put our best foot forward, and we got to kill on these and load them up and really make them excellent. In terms of Avengers, I had read Avengers for years. It was a book that I was familiar with, but I didn't have a strong connection to it. My book was always Fantastic Four, and still really kind of is.
Oh, we're going to get to that for sure.
Yeah, but so taking over Avengers, it wasn't so much like, now I'll edit Avengers and I'll do it the right way. It was more, okay, we're going to do Avengers, and Kurt and I got on the phone, as we often did, and we would spend about 3 hours on the phone on a phone call, because we used to have that amount of time, and talked about the Avengers and what we thought and which characters and how to approach it and all of that stuff. And then ended up with George, especially. George is a huge key part of this whole question, but ended up making the comics that we made, and they struck a chord with an audience like yourself, and with a young audience that had been reading the Heroes Reborn books too. Like those books did well, and so on that level, we succeeded in what the objective was. But it wasn't so much, other than it was, it's Kurt's aesthetic, it's my aesthetic. So yeah, there's a lot of us, and really more Kurt and George than me. But there's a lot of us in that run. But it wasn't so much going, this is the right way, so much as it is, let's do a good comic.
And what I would say is, I don't mean to imply that Heroes Reborn was the ruined the Avengers, in that they were pretty much in a down slide way before that. I mean, the Roger Stern, John Buscema stuff was great, and then after that, they started to go down pretty quickly to teenage Tony Stark and stuff that was just unreadable. So it got saved though by Busiek bringing it back and under your editorial.
Well, thank you. That's nice of you to say. It certainly worked out okay for the Avengers in the years since then. Yes,
very, very much. I wanted to ask you about the Ultimate Universe that comes in under this. Yep. Now, it was almost like Heroes Reborn, but done much, much better. And it had staying power. What was the consensus around editorial about that? Were people in favor of it? Were they nervous about it?
It tended to vary from person to person. The Ultimate Universe was very much Bill Jemas's baby. He had a lot of belief in it, and he also tended to stock it up and give it the same kind of advantages that Heroes Reborn had before that, which is to say, you could spend more money on it. You could make, you could risk thinner profit margins. Those early Ultimate books, not only were they priced at $225, which I think was less than or the same price as the other Marvel books, but they had cardstock covers, and they spent more on the coloring and more on, he really saw that though as the thing that needed to be done to save Marvel and to save the industry, because he felt, rightly or wrongly, that the Marvel books of the period were too steeped in years and years of continuity, and that a civilian audience, so to speak, could not pick up a Marvel book and fathom it, couldn't understand it. It was just argle-bargle to them. And so he wanted to build a universe that would be very clean, but also a universe that would then be contemporary. It would be the 2000 version of these things. So, like a year or two before that, John Byrne had done Spider-Man Chapter 1.
Yes.
And Spider-Man Chapter 1 was not what Bill wanted to do. Bill looked at that and went, this is stupid. You're telling 1962 stories in 1997, and no kid is wearing a sweater vest, and no kid is fumbling around with a microscope. You have to think about your audience today. You have to build these characters, keep the essence of them the way they were, but you need to make them function for an audience today. And a young ostracized smart kid isn't going to be the picked on nerd like the Peter Parker of 1962. He's going to be much more an emo kid like this, because if you look at the pop culture of the time, this is much more where the zeitgeist is. And so Bill's approach on all of that stuff was kind of, let's do that. And he really, he believed in that very strongly. He associated with it very strongly. He was very involved in all of those books, and they really had his fingerprints on them in terms of that part of the mission statement. And again, to the point where it was almost an unfair advantage. For the Marvel Previews catalog, Ultimate Spider-Man was the cover 6 months in a row. And the only reason it wasn't 7 months is in the 7 months they launched Ultimate X-Men. But so if you were just doing Iron Man at that time, you were not getting the same level of resources that were being given to these new titles.
So why do you think ultimately, and really the book that was a standout was obviously Ultimate Spider-Man, but why do you think that ultimately Ultimate Universe failed?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One, when those books launched, and this is really a credit to Joe, I feel like particularly, they were good. They had good talent doing good work. And people really responded to that, and on top of which they had an aesthetic, they had an ethos, and the longer that went on, two things happened. One, a lot of that talent tended to migrate from the Ultimate Universe further out into the mainstream Marvel Universe. Once upon a time, Brian Bendis wrote Spider-Man, and then he wrote New Avengers, and that's a different place. And so the specialness of the Ultimate Universe as a boutique line kind of eroded. Plus, as time went on, as different creators rotated in and maybe didn't have runs that were quite so long or weren't seen as quite so special, that particular friction that the line had began to erode away. There were still people that loved it and were super invested in it all the way up to when it was eventually stopped in 2015 or so forth, 15 years later. That's a hell of a run for a line like that.
And has great impact in terms of the Marvel movies today, probably more than the comics.
Sure. But that initial moment of excitement just couldn't be maintained at that level, partly because it got bigger, partly because its own continuity began to be just as long. Once you've done 160 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, you can't pretend it's as new reader friendly as you wanted it to be when you started. You just can't.
Right.
And so all of these things together basically conspired to take the Ultimate line from being, this is a super boutique line. It's like the Black Label of Marvel. It's the special stuff over here that's really, really good and really pure, to being, it's books Marvel publishes. Not materially different or better or worse than that month's issue of Amazing Spider-Man. You got Amazing Spider-Man, you got Ultimate Spider-Man. They're kind of the same thing. It just kind of depends on whether you want the peppermint flavor or whether you want the butter pecan flavor.
So one additional Spider-Man question, talking about Untold Tales of Spider-Man and that revisionist, going back and dwelling on the past. Is there any truth to that Ditko was talking about doing something related to Spider-Man and he got mad at Untold Tales of Spider-Man and backed out of it?
Yes, although I don't know that Untold Tales itself was the reason he backed out of it. They did, Ralph Macchio, who was then the Spider-Man editor, longtime Marvel editor, spoke to Ditko a couple of times about reuniting him and Stan for one last Spider-Man book. And Ditko had serious conversations with Ralph about this. In particular, deep enough that I know that he was saying, well, we'll set it during his last summer before he graduates high school, because Ditko, his opinions over the years had only grown more more intractable, and he was really of the opinion that they never should have graduated Spider-Man from high school to begin with, because it's okay for a high school kid to be sort of insecure and to make mistakes and to foul up, but if a grown man does that, he's not a hero anymore. He's a failure. He's not allowed the same stumbles as a kid is. And so Ditko, said, we'll set it during his last summer. And so, Ralph sent him some books for reference and such, to show him what was going on and to keep him enmeshed in stuff. And as they were going to plot this out. And as Ralph relayed the conversation to myself and Glenn Greenberg after it all happened, he got on the phone with him, and Ditko said something like, "Oh, I have collaborators now, do I?" Talking to the Untold Tales stuff, and it was one of the things where, the very fact that stuff was there, and whether or not, I don't know, maybe I would have been egotistical enough to say, "Oh, no. Ralph, you can't let him do that because it'll contradict Untold Tales of Spider-Man." I like to hope that I would have been smart enough to go, Steve Ditko can, let him do whatever the hell he wants on that Spider-Man story. It'll be fine. It's not going to hurt Untold Tales. But either way, Ditko felt like this stuff was there. It was more of an impediment. And between all of that project never happened. It actually transformed. It turned into the Spider-Man Kingpin to the Death book that Stan did with John Romita instead of Ditko.
Oh, I see.
That was the book that took its place. But if things had gone differently, it might have been a last Stan and Steve Spider-Man story.
So in 2001, there was also sort of a becoming the end of the Comics Code, partly because of X-Force number 116, the Allred Milligan, and a move toward maybe the precursor to what the Max line was going to be, that you were pushing the boundaries in terms of adultness and violence. Were you involved at all in the X-Force decision, how the tone that was to take?
No, that was all, Axel and Joe and Bill. I think Bill had been looking for an excuse to get rid of the Comics Code because he didn't believe in it and he didn't understand it. We were paying these people money to tell us what we could and couldn't publish, and his take was, my judgment is going to be as good or better than theirs, and we get to keep the money. So, whatever we feel comfortable with is what we publish. So why should we do this? The days when anybody cared whether a Comics Code sticker is on a cover or not are long past. And so, he did it with theater, but he quit the code, very intentionally. And X-Force 116 was the first piece of that, doing a book that was deliberately, in air quotes, transgressive. And it's sort of a weird thing because that seemed like a big step, but it's not like Vertigo hadn't been around for 10 years at that point. And the sort of books that, like Joe had gravitated to as a reader getting back into comics. He had read comics as a kid and then, outgrew them. And then, in his early 20s, found comics again, and the comics that brought him back were things like Watchmen and Dark Knight and the Preacher and the Sandman. The more Vertigo skewing, more adult sensibility comics, Frank Miller's work, and so aesthetically that was always more in Joe's wheelhouse to begin with, and Bill was completely comfortable with that as well. He didn't see a reason not to do any of that stuff. So coming in, these beliefs that the characters have to behave a certain way, or there's a limitation as to how far you can take it. Bill's take on that is why not? Why what happens if you don't do that? What happens if you let those restrictions up and let the creators tell the best stories that they can tell and work within your own boundaries as to what is right or wrong or tasteful and not tasteful.
Now, you were part of it in terms of the Max series, though, and talking about taking the boundaries as far as you want to take it. I think of that first page of Alias, number 1.
Right.
And because you were the editor on that. That was something.
I was not. I edited Alias, but I edited it at the very end of the run.
Oh, so you weren't there for that first issue?
No. I was again. I was around, but I didn't edit it. That was Brian and Michael, and again Bill. I think loved that because Bill delighted in creating controversy and turning controversy into press, into sales. He didn't think there was any such thing as any bad publicity, and so. Again, in a sort of, Stan Lee through a broken mirror kind of approach, the idea that there'd be a book that would start off so transgressive and that maybe we could find a printer who will refuse to print it, and then we can make a story out of the fact that they refuse to print it, and that'll make people want to read it even more because it's the thing that they shouldn't have. He was very canny about how he presented that stuff.
And what was it that when it came out? I mean, was there a lot of feedback in the office? Can you believe what we just put out? Were people excited, troubled? Any reaction?
Again, I think it differed from person to person. Was it to everybody's tastes? How strongly or poorly did they feel towards it? I think as a series, people all liked and respected Alias.
Yeah, it's good.
Whether or not they felt that opening bit was just sensationalism for the sake of sensationalism or not, I think that's an individual, opinion. I don't think there was a massive agreement on that. It was there to make a statement, and the statement was, Max Comics, we'll go we're willing to go this far right up front, right on the first page. So this is not the Marvel that you're familiar with. In fact, it doesn't even have a Marvel name on it. And so, this is if you're coming on board for the Max experience, this is what you can expect to find, at least at the outer edge of it.
And was this your first, once you came on board on Alias, was this your first working together with Bendis?
Yeah, I think the Alias was the first thing I did with him. Although again, I only kept the book for like an issue or two before I handed it over to my associate editor, Andy Schmidt, because I was busy doing a lot of other things. I did by hand the 2 issues that were the Secret Origin issues.
Right.
And the whole reason I remember that is I know I had a conversation with Brian about how the lettering was going to be handled in the flashbacks. And the way we decided to do it was that all of the existing Amazing Fantasy 15 characters spoke in all caps, and all of the new Jessica Jones characters spoke in upper lower as they typically did. And the very fact that I had a conversation about that, and that was something I was thinking about, is the thing that lets me go, right, that's the point at which I was involved. I think it was 23, might have been 22.
And did you play a part in the decision to disassemble the Avengers and then turn it over to Bendis and go forward with that? Was he a choice for on your part to take over the Avengers?
I was involved in that whole process. That wasn't necessarily my choice. One of the things that had happened at that point is, as we tend to do now routinely, we had an editorial retreat where we brought a lot of talent and all of our editors and got together for 3 days or so to talk about the books and to chart out the future. And we talked about Avengers at a certain point and what was going on and what the book was missing and that sort of thing. And Mark Miller, did a whole, little dissertation as to what he thought Avengers should be about and what was missing from it. And his take was it should be all the best characters. It should be, what the Justice League is to DC. It should be, all the headliners, because that's what I wanted when I was a kid. If you had all the headliners in one book and all the biggest guys, like that'd be the best book ever. And, I know that whatever, Spider-Man and Wolverine haven't been in the Avengers, but why haven't they? They should just be in the Avengers. They're the biggest characters. Put them all in a book together. And so we walked out of that day of the meeting, like clearly something was going to change. And this was a problem for me because at the time, Chuck Austin had only just taken over Avengers, and he was leading up to Avengers 500 and the launch of Invaders and so forth. And suddenly all of that was being thrown out. And so I was very focused at that point on managing triage on that situation. And I thought, okay, so Mark's going to write Avengers. And I was fine with that. I had a history with Mark. The first Marvel work he did for me on Skrull Kill Crew. And he'd done a bunch of things over the years. I knew Mark. I was comfortable with him. So I knew. And the next day of the retreat, everybody came back in. And while they were out, like that night, Brian and Mark were both staying in the same hotel. They had dinner together and so forth. And Brian said, "Hey, I really want to do this Avengers book. Would you mind if I did it?" And Mark said, "Yeah, okay, you do it." So Brian came in, and he talked to Joe and whatnot, and it was okay. Brian's going to do Avengers, and I sort of whiplashed, like, "Why? Brian's going to do Avengers now?" And I had no particular relationship with Brian at that point, other than, the understanding, the realization that he had a real favored nations situation. He was very tight with Joe. Bill was kind of out of the picture by that point, so he was a non-issue. And he had a contract that guaranteed him certain things that made him more difficult to edit than the average person. I mean, I say that Brian was never particularly difficult to edit or work with. I don't want to frame it that way, but Brian had aspects of his deal that guaranteed him things like artist approval. And so, I'll always work with a writer or with a creator on who the other people involved in a book are. But theoretically, on any given title, the final call ultimately is mine, whether or not I choose to use it that way or not. And on a Brian book, it was Brian's. and so it's just a different. Wow. And so it's just a different situation. And so going into that, it was a little dicey because I didn't know this guy and I didn't know where he was going to be coming from or how he was going to go. And also, and Brian has kind of copped to this later on, like Brian kind of came in with I'll call it a punk sensibility, although Brian is not at all, from punk culture. He kind of came in with, I'm going to burn it all down and then build it all back up in a better way. And the part, that he kind of realized, particularly as fans started to respond to some of what he was doing, that he really understood was the stuff he was burning down was stuff that a bunch of people really liked. I had spent at that point 10 years, working on, or seven years, whatever, working on it. And you're coming in and you're telling me you're going to burn it all down. Like, there's no way to not take some degree of umbrage at that. And so, again, like Brian and I, felt each other out, and over the course of a couple of issues, like we got comfortable, and we found a rhythm. Like, he says that the moment he felt like, yeah, okay, this was pretty good and this was all going to work, was the moment when I got George Perez to draw the very end of the Avengers finale book.
Right.
And that was a big thing for Brian because he was a fan of George's and he always wanted to work with him. But also, like, that felt like a good handing of the baton. And I always knew that commercially New Avengers was going to work. There was no way it wasn't. It was the getting to it that was the rough part. So once we were there, it was a lot easier to kind of click in and go, right, we're doing this now, and we have to figure out how to make this go. And obviously, I worked with Brian an awful lot for an awful long time. And that was a very fruitful relationship.
So, as an editor on a group of characters that you knew very well at this point, were there ever points where you thought to yourself, "Well, that's not what Captain America would do. That just sounds like Bendis. It doesn't sound like Captain America." And if so, could you say to him, I don't like that? Or was he kind of in charge, almost not self-editing, but you said he had a lot of power?
Yeah. And honestly, the answer to that really comes down to is it's all about relationships. So at that outset, I didn't have the relationship with Brian. And so I feel like it was tougher initially to get him to really listen and take on board something that I would say. At the same time, I was really, in a defensive mode. For Brian's first script for Avengers 500, I sent him back notes, and it was, I think there were about 16 notes all told. Pretty much none of which actually got done, as it turned out. And some of them, I haven't looked back. I don't have that set of notes anymore. But some of them, I suspect, were notes that were more about me and the Avengers that had come before versus where things were going and where things were going to be happening now. So it's a learning process. You build the relationship with the people that you're working with, and you win not by force, but you win by convincing people that what you're saying is correct. For all that I can look at something like the death of Hawkeye in Avengers 502 and go, yeah, that's not what I would have wanted it to be.
Yeah.
I also know that that's better than the first version, where Brian did a first draft and I, talked to him or, called him on the phone or sent him reactions, and he revised it to bring it more in line with what I what I had to say. So Brian was never intractable on any of this stuff. It was just always a question as to whether or not I could convince him that what I was saying was right. And what that meant early on was I very quickly realized I have to pick and choose my shots very carefully. To use an Axel Alonso term, I had to deal with the gut wound and not the scratches and the abrasions, because I could get him to change a scratch or an abrasion, but the patient is going to bleed out in the meantime. So really, it was, at least at the outset, and again, as we worked together longer, it became a much more simpatico relationship, and we could talk to one another, and there was mutual respect. So at the outset, again, a lot of this was probably on my end more than anybody's. I was just in a very combative mental state because of all this stuff.
Now, you were editing Brubaker's Captain America at the same time, right?
Yes.
Did you feel like there was a consistency in the two Captain Americas and in the voice, or was it hard to juggle the two of them?
I didn't worry about it on that level. In that, I was more focused on make the book good. In the broadest sense, as long as Captain America is Captain America, does things that Captain America does, espouses the virtues that Captain America stands for, seems to behave as Captain America would, I was fine. And the other piece that was there at that time that has long been forgotten now was I was also editing Priest's Captain America and the Falcon book, which was a third title
Right.
that Cap was in, and that also had a slightly different point of view on the character. One of the beautiful things about the Marvel characters and most of the fictional characters in comics is that they are broad enough to contain multitudes, and there are a lot of different ways of approaching them that are valid or can be valid. So I didn't necessarily, I wasn't at any point thinking about, well, the guy in Avengers doesn't seem like the guy in Captain America. It was more let's make the Captain America issue good, let's make the Avengers issue good.
You had a great stable of writers at that particular juncture, especially on Avenger-related books, because you had Fraction working on Iron Man and Brubaker working on Captain America, and it was as good as it ever got in terms of those core characters. They were just great. And then you had Bendis and the Avengers, which was harder for me as an Avengers fan, but it had some good stories.
Look, I can understand that, and certainly, like I'm in, having been on Avengers for so long, I'm in the weird period. I'm in a weird place where I can talk to Avengers fans of different eras, and I'm either like you were saying earlier, I'm the guy that saved the Avengers, or I'm the guy that destroyed the Avengers,
or both.
And sometimes both in the same conversation. And some of that is just the nature of you do it long enough, and everybody's going to like or hate something that you do. It's kind of inevitable. But that constant role of change and that constant need for the characters to be dynamic and to reinvent themselves and to push into areas that you've never seen them do before is all necessary to keep them alive and vibrant, I think.
So, speaking of destroying the Avengers, let's talk about Civil War for a minute.
Yep.
Was there a point where people were concerned that you were making the entire Marvel universe so unlikable, where Reed Richards is like the biggest dick on the planet, and he wasn't the only one, obviously. I mean, the hole that was being dug for characters like Spider-Man, where it's like, where do you come? Did y'all see riding off a cliff that it was going to be hard to come back from some of these character developments?
I would say no. And I would say no, like, again, obviously you had a strong reaction to that storyline, and that's fair. Like every reader, comes at these things from a certain point of view and a certain place. But there's no question that all of those characters have continued to be successful since then. There hasn't been any need to repair them or fix them. That any damage that was done to anybody was not lingering. It was passing damage, and it was mostly in the heads or in the emotions of the individual audience members who felt that way about stuff. I can say that there were aspects of Civil War that went further in certain respects than I would have liked. But that has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of those books were done by people who were not Mark. And this is maybe the place where I differ from the audience a little bit. Going into Civil War from the jump, I could have told you right away that the fan audience is going to be entirely on the Captain America side and not on the pro-registration side. But I can also tell you absolutely that in the real world, I would be, and most everybody would be on the pro-registration side and not on the Captain America side. And this was all being done. Like, that story developed in the shadow of 9/11, and it came from days in which I'd go pass through Penn Station on my commute to work, and there'd be National Guardsmen in full like riot gear with enormous AK-47s there to in case something happened. And theoretically, those guys are there to protect me and protect the peace. But there's nothing more unnerving than walking through an area that's like lined with those guys. And so, being able to take that idea and go, right, if there were superheroes, if there were guys who put on masks, who had crazy amounts of power, who ran around beating up whoever they felt like it because they said they were bad people, and nobody knew who they were, and nobody had any control or oversight on them, you bet everybody would be like, we got to put a stop to this. So that question and that metaphor was very much of its time, but also very potent and very direct. And so, the place where some people ran into trouble, and I'm gonna point to him directly now, although I don't see this as a condemnation of him. So hopefully he'll feel the same way. But Joe Straczynski wrote a lot of the tie-ins on Spider-Man and on a few other things. And Joe, on this particular point, politically, had a very strong belief. He is absolutely 100% the Captain America side. That's Joe's fundamental, at his gut, at his core feeling. And so anytime he had to write a scene from the perspective of somebody that was on the other side, Joe is an excellent writer, and Joe is really good at being able to put his mind and his head into viewpoints that are not his own. But for this particular issue, especially in the shadow of 9/11 and the way the country had been going around that time, he couldn't do it. His interpretations of Iron Man and Reed and so forth, he could not find ways to make them sympathetic in their point of view.
He made them total fascists, didn't he? I mean,
yes, he very much. He certainly was on the most extreme end of that. There were a couple of other guys too. Paul Jenkins did a couple of things in the Frontline book that kind of verged that way as well. And so, while I feel like if you just read Civil War, like the main 7 issues that Mark does, I feel like it's reasonably even-handed. I feel like everybody in that 7 issues, they come off as right, they come off as wrong, they make good choices, they make bad choices, and everybody kind of comes out evenly. Once you add in all of the other tie-ins and all the extended stuff, it's a somewhat lopsided presentation.
So is there one person that oversees all of that on some level, or is it not that consolidated?
There is in theory, technically, I was looking at all of the various scripts and things for Civil War tie-ins as they came in. On a practical level, one, it's a lot of material, and two, I don't know that it's smart or right for my ethos to be the one that guides every creative choice that everybody makes in the course of telling a story. I directly edited JMS on some of the Civil War tie-ins he did. I was editing Fantastic Four, and he was writing it. And so everything he did in those books has a full-on sign-off from me, regardless of whether or not, if you ask me in the abstract, well, that scene he did in 541, do you agree with that? Do you think, Reed or Ben or whomever would do that? And I would go, well, I don't know if I do entirely, but he does, and it's his job to write the story. And particularly when you come down to writers who are working in other editorial offices and with other editors, you're now negotiating through another editor to another creator about what they're doing. And a lot of that is a question of degrees. Again, for all that I can say, yeah, Joe really had a point of view on Civil War that was not fair and balanced because he believed in it so strongly. The pull quote that everybody still uses, the one that ended up in the movie, is a Joe Straczynski Captain America quote: "Tree of Truth." Tree by the river of truth. You stand there,
right?
And so by letting him tell his story, my theory on it was you're going to end up having creators that are all over the spectrum on this. They're each going to believe the right and the wrong things are slightly different. And if you let everybody have the same kind of equal opportunity to do their thing, in aggregate, you're going to end up getting something that's more or less balanced. In practice, I don't know that actually worked out that way. But in trying to make this all happen, that was sort of the method in which I tried to approach it.
All right, so I have to wrap up this decade within 10 minutes, so I'm going to be fast about it on some things. But Fantastic Four, was it your decision? My understanding is you were a big push and advocate to bring Hickman in on Fantastic Four to give it a new feel to it. Is that right?
I hired John to do Fantastic Four. Yes, and
I love that series. The two books. I mean, that's one of my favorite Fantastic Fours, right up there with just very few that are actually as good as the Stan and Jack stuff. And this one really understood those characters. You were happy with it, I assume.
Oh yeah. John did great work on that book, and I wish it had gone on. I wish he had been able to do more, to go longer. It was a good run. He probably ended at the right time, but I liked it, and I wouldn't have minded doing another year or two.
Do you? I thought the Death of Human Torch worked well. Do you think Marvel went to that well too many times between Death of Captain America, Death of Human Torch, and Death of Wolverine?
I don't know about too many times. It's obviously one of the, for lack of a better term, levers that can be pulled that can garner, reader interest and enthusiasm. And to me, on the one hand, all these characters are fictional. So they live and die by the whims of whoever's creating them at any given point. And the idea of permanence, as a younger reader, I believed in the permanence of the fictional universe, and I didn't understand the idea that people just make it up every month.
Yeah.
And I still see that from readers today, audience members who will write in upset about a particular story development or a thing, and how could that, and the way they react to it is as though somewhere there's a massive book in Lucian's library that says everything that happens in the Marvel universe, and you've transcribed something wrong. Like, they really have a belief where the fact is we make it up every month. We come up with it out of our imaginations. And so to me, the death of a character, the deaths in comics that I hate the most are the self-aware, self-parodying, wink and a nod deaths. I tend to think of this as a thing that Peter David has done more often than most people. But the example I'm going to point to is Grant Morrison, who's a writer that I like and respect an awful lot. But I think it was during Final Crisis. Final Crisis opens with the Martian Manhunter dying.
Yeah.
And all of the
that
Justice,
was a cheap one. Absolutely.
And all of the Justice League get together at his funeral, and Superman says, "I hope he has a swift resurrection." And on the one hand, you go, well, that's somebody playing into the fact that we all know these are fictional characters and they're going to come back from the dead. On the other hand, it's emotional bullshit, because what makes the death of any character powerful is what makes the death of any human being powerful. The fact that this is an inescapable finality and a fate that is awaiting all of us. And if you can play into that truthfully, you can do stories, even if the character comes back again, that really carry weight and have an impact. Yeah, and the ones that piss that away for a knowing joke, right? I'm as smart as the audience is. I feel like that does a disservice to the story and even to the medium. I don't like them.
Although I would say Hawkeye was one of those as well. But yes, I.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
My question about Fantastic Four is it must have sold reasonably well, because even after Hickman left, you guys were still publishing it as two different series. Why did y'all let it die? I know that was incredibly sad to long-term Marvel people to not have a Fantastic Four.
Right.
How was that decision made?
It's a couple of things. One was that John was doing Secret Wars, and the Secret Wars, or the underlying idea of Secret Wars, was something that he had come up with when we were working on Fantastic Four. And in fact, if he had stayed on Fantastic Four, we would have gotten to Secret Wars there rather than in Avengers. But once we did AVX and decided we were going to mix all the teams up, and John ended up on Avengers, we moved all of those ideas over to the Avengers side. The reality of Fantastic Four, and it makes me sad as much as anybody else, is it's tough to sell a Fantastic Four book today. The audience today, sees those characters as being somewhat out of step or passé. And not always, people can do good things and do good stories and do big stuff with them. But John left Fantastic Four, and Matt Fraction had a very nice run on it, and James Robinson had a very nice run on it. But all throughout those runs, your sales tended to taper off and go down and so forth. There is a point at which sometimes the best thing you can do for a character or a property is to take it away for a while. Because, the month before Fantastic Four went away, 27,000 people were paying attention to that book maybe. And the month after it went away, everybody was like, where is it? Why isn't it here? I liken this, and you're of the right generation for this. I liken this to The Flash. I was a huge fan of The Flash, the Barry Allen Flash, but I stopped reading it before it went into the trial of Barry Allen.
And that was a good place to leave too, because that was hard going.
Yeah, but I came off, and a lot of people came off, and then they got up to Crisis, and they announced that in the course of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Barry Allen is going to die, and not myself, but a lot of people around me were like, "How can they kill Barry? Oh, this is a tragedy. And you would ask those people, like, when was the last time you actually read Flash? And they would say, well, it's been 5 years, but I love the character and I love the. And you kind of go, well, that's the problem right there. You've taken this thing for granted. You assume it's a constant. You assume it's always going to be there. And sometimes you have to walk away from it to make it work again. The same thing was kind of true, as much as I don't necessarily want to admit it, with Thor. Like, Thor didn't have a book for a bunch of years there. And when Thor came back and Joe and Olivier Coipel, came onto it, that book was a top-selling thing. Everybody was excited about Thor again in a way that they had not been when we closed it out 2 or 3 years earlier.
Yeah, it needed a break, I think.
So between the fact that John was doing Secret Wars and that was intended to be ultimately a big Fantastic Four-centric story, and the fact that it was always difficult to keep FF going as a concern, we said, okay, let's make this, in air quotes, the last Fantastic Four story and take them off the board for a while. And then our hope was we would get exactly the reaction that you're talking about from people and build up to the point where when we bring it back, it'll be a real event and a triumph, and people will really love it and embrace it again the way we want them to. So
in 2007, that's when you became executive editor. Did your job, besides your job title, what changed with that designation?
At Marvel, I think more often than not, the way it works is first you do the job and then you get the title. Becoming executive editor was a huge surprise to me. I wasn't particularly working towards it. I had no idea that it was a thing, and whatever that year was, that post-Civil War year, when I came in to do my yearly performance review with Joe, which was always a fairly perfunctory thing, where he'd say, "Yep, you're doing great, everything's fine," and he told me this, and I was like sort of stunned by it, and I was stunned by it for about a week. Basically, as executive editor, it means I have more eyes on more things in a broader sense. I oversee more people and have maybe a slightly louder voice, although I always had a loud voice, in the shape and the direction that the Marvel Universe as a whole is taking. Nobody has an absolute voice in that, but like I was saying earlier, it's all about being able to convince people that you're right. And so I went from directly overseeing, a crew of 4 or 5 other editors to pretty much, sort of overseeing at least half of the line. And that doesn't mean I was editing it. That means I was, checking in. I was another sounding board and another voice as people came up with stuff. I could keep stupid things from happening every once in a while, and I could hopefully throw out ideas and improve on ideas that people already had when they had a story. And if there was something that was of value there, they could take it and incorporate it, and if there wasn't, they could discard it and move on with their lives.
So was it more fun or less fun having the additional powers?
Honestly, I haven't quite quantified it that way. Certainly, it's always nice when people listen to you. but I don't feel like, for the most part, people didn't listen to me before I was executive editor. So, there are days when it's better than other days, and those days tend to be the days when you have to do something bad. We just went into COVID 4 or 5 months ago, and there were points where I had to call up a lot of people and go, hey, we don't know when Diamond is restarting again. We don't know when books are going to come out. I need you to halt work at the moment, and I'll be in touch when I can tell you to start up again. And those are terrible days to have to live through, both for the people that you're working with and for yourself and the rest of your staff. Having any sort of degree of authority means you have to be able and willing to do the dirty work when the time comes and it has to be done. On the flip side, it means that if I get a stupid idea for something, I could probably more often than not make it happen. And so consequently, the comic book racks for the last 13 years have been littered with my stupid ideas. Some of which were good and some of which were maybe not as good. But I've never, even in the worst periods, I've never not enjoyed doing the work, doing the job. I've not enjoyed parts of it. I've not enjoyed particular interactions or the particular vibe on the floor or whatnot, or where things were. But the actual work of making comics, I've never not liked doing. So, it's all kind of the same to me.
I'm going to ask you one more fanboy question, and then I'm going to let Alex ask you about Disney, and then he and I are going to go back and forth asking you sort of rapid fire questions for the last half hour or so.
Okay.
But my question is, I thought the Abnett and Lanning cosmic stuff was one of Marvel's great runs in terms of that all of those books, all those series were so much fun. Why were they pulled or left and Bendis put in charge of Guardians, which never quite recovered what the cosmic aspect that Hickman had? He was doing in Fantastic Four and building a lot upon the Abnett Lanning stuff. But what happened there?
I think, what you're sort of asking in a sense is, why did this change? Yeah. And the answer to that ultimately over time is always that everything changes. People do runs, people stay on books, people transition off of books, new people come onto books. I don't know that there was anything bigger about it than that. Certainly when Brian came in, it was with the knowledge that there was going to be a Guardians movie of some sort at some point in the future. And so us bringing Brian in and Steve McNiven, who I believe did his first arc, maybe his first 2 arcs, the idea was this is going to be big and important to Marvel as an entity. So we put our biggest guys there and show that we're committed to it and we're behind it. It's in a way no different than we just announced literally this past weekend that Kieran Gillen and Esad Ribic are going to be doing Eternals. And, that's the same kind of thing. We know an Eternals film is coming. We know Eternals is going to be a big thing for everybody. And we're going to put our, the best foot forward that we can with those characters and with that property, so that hopefully not only is there some excitement in our world that helps to set up what gets done, elsewhere, but also so that when it comes time to make Eternals 2 or Eternals 3, there's a new chunk of cool material that those guys have to draw on. So it was the same kind of opinion. If I'm remembering right, and it's been a while, so forgive me if I'm getting my timeline wrong. It wasn't that Dan and Andy were replaced by Brian. It was that book ended, and then Brian's book started I'm going to say 6 months later.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, so the end of that run was the end of that run. That was happening either way. And it was really only the fact that, there's going to be a Guardians film, and we should probably be doing something here, that made people go, right, we better get on with this now. Otherwise, we might have gone 2 years or 3 years without a Guardians book, as we often do with other properties. But there wasn't anything especially sinister about it. If anything, it was kind of the opposite. It was trying to do the best, with the biggest guys that we had.
Right. And I think it sounds like yours, like, okay, we're going to make this, want to keep this cool. We're going to put some cool people on it. There's a movie coming out. I would say probably maybe the question would be more directed more toward Bendis and why he kind of let go of some of the stuff that the previous guys built. And I think that's probably more of an individual creator rather than a Marvel corporate.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, I didn't work so much directly on that book. I had some conversation with Brian at the very outset, because there was 2 seconds when it looked like I might. And Brian approached it like he approaches everything that he does. He stared at it. He read up on a bunch of stuff. He found the pieces that spoke the most to him, and he went out to try and tell stories that felt valid to his sensibility. Right. And he doesn't come from the same place that Dan does, or that Andy does, or that any of the other predecessors come from. He comes from the world he lives in. But as long as he's telling his stories with emotional truth driving them, that's what ultimately will make them work. But there's no such thing as a magic bullet. We were talking about FF before, and John Hickman succeeded Mark Miller and Brian Hitch on Fantastic Four, and they came on to FF after finishing up Ultimates. And that's about as close to a slam dunk creative team as I could imagine at that point. That was going to be a monster. And yet somehow, for whatever reason, it's not like the book sold poorly, but it never quite caught fire the way I would have anticipated. And so one of the reasons... It's
like making a stew, right? It doesn't always come out.
Yeah. You just can't tell what the zeitgeist is or what's going to work. So when it came time to succeed them, one of the reasons I went to John was, I thought about who else could do this, and they had done it, and before them, JMS had done it, and like I had put a bunch of really big guys on the book. Maybe it was time then to take a guy that was not yet big, a smaller guy, but who had a voice that I liked, and plug them in there. And that was John. He was doing Secret Warriors with me. And was looking for other stuff to do, but he hadn't really cracked through in a big way. But from Secret Warriors, I could tell like he's a guy that's got a particular brain, a particular mindset, and he'll do some interesting things here. And he hadn't been a Fantastic Four fan at all. He was never a reader, so he read up on all of that stuff, and he distilled it, as he tends to do, down to I think 3 volumes of notebooks and things that were his thesis on Fantastic Four. And that worked out. You never tell. Every time you end up, casting a series, you take the best shot you can. Whatever your instinct is for what the series needs, where the world is right now, what the last guys did that worked, what the last guys did that didn't work so well, all of that stuff. But then it's ultimately down to what the audience feels. There's no. It's not math. It's alchemy.
Yeah, right. Alchemy. Yeah, the stew of throw some meat, throw some onion. We'll see what happens. So then now Marvel having the digital comics in 2007. That's kind of a bit of a milestone. Has that improved sales or maybe even awareness of people see a digital comic and they say, "Oh, I want to go buy one." Did that improve the Marvels? As far as sales goes, was that a good step forward as far as entering the future?
I think it was definitely a good step. And one of the things that's proven itself out over the course of that time, for all that everybody, particularly retailers, were very worried about digital at the outset, was that digital doesn't seem to cut into the sales of tangible. Which is to say that whether or not there's a digital copy of Avengers tends to sell what it sells. And there's a reader that likes it, that likes having that physical copy, whether it's the monthly release or whether it's the trade paperback or the hardcovers, or hopefully all 3. But there's a separate audience that likes digital, whether it's for the immediacy and not needing to go out to a store, or whether it's not having the space or the room to store it all, or just being more comfortable with a screen, whatever the case may be, that whole sales model tends to be additive. It's still, in terms of proportions, it's still not even half of our audience, but it's a place where clearly over time there's the potential for growth, and a lot of growth. And so I think it's an absolutely necessary step in terms of keeping Marvel and keeping the characters and the series viable into the future.
Right.
There hasn't been any real downside to it. There's a certain number of man hours it takes to prep a comic for digital release, but once you've got the comic that you've done to print, it's not that labor intensive,
right?
And then all the revenue is gravy. So on that level,
it sounds like it didn't really take away from hard. It just added more sales in general.
Yeah. Whether those are sales of like the digital sits on top of the monthly, or there are people that buy stuff digitally and then buy collections of the stuff that they really love to have it on their shelves permanently. And that's another way that feeder system works. And
that's kind of cool. So now another thing, as far as preserving Marvel for the future, when Disney bought Marvel in 2009, were you like, okay, here we go again, another corporate shakeup, or were you like, hey, this is a good move, this actually is the real deal?
I was relatively nonplussed, having been through this kind of thing before. And what made it most or least unsettling, let's say, was that in the run up to it, Joe had gone out, and a couple of our other key people had gone out and talked with people and taken meetings with Disney people, and hung out at Pixar and done all of this stuff. And so Joe coming back and saying, yeah, look, I've talked to all these guys, I've seen how they operate, I've done this is all going to be good. Makes that feel a little more real than somebody you've never heard of walking into the bullpen saying, hey, I've got mouse ears and I run the place now.
Yeah.
This was while it was a Disney purchase, there was there's much more of an aspect of it being a merger, creatively to it. And again, everybody since then wants to blame Disney for whatever it is they don't happen to like about Marvel at any given point. Like it's a commonly thrown around thing in fan circles, and for the most part, it's just not true.
Yeah. So it's more just a basis of like the current staff at the time, not because Disney is diluting the brand or directing it in some way.
Yeah, ultimately, all of the Disney stuff has been positive. The one thing Disney has had, and you've seen it happen over the last decade, is they've always had a massive global reach.
Yes.
Their characters and their properties in film, in television, as merchandise, as tchotchkes, they're everywhere, and that ability to get these characters out onto a worldwide stage has been absolutely invaluable. To the point now where forget about like Iron Man. People on the ass end of the world know who Groot is, which is bananas.
Sure.
Anybody that would have thought that was the case in 2009. Put aside the fact that he was in a movie, they know that character, and they know there's a little version that dances because they've got one on their desk.
Yes, true. Disney does help that. Yeah, I mean, who would have thought the Planet X guy from the 50s would be all over the place?
Like all of that stuff is hugely helpful. Right. And really, for the most part, in terms of particularly when it comes down to like comic book publishing, our day-to-day isn't really any different. There haven't been a lot of mandates. There haven't been a lot of, it's got to be this and whatnot. And all the stuff that fans fulminate over, they've lost the whatever. If it is true that we have lost the whatever, it's because we lost it, not because Disney made anything happen. There's no choke noose around anybody's neck, keeping them from making whatever imaginary comic you want them to be.
That's why we haven't seen, Jim, Carol Danvers as a princess and Marcus as Prince Charming. It's no wonder we haven't seen that, because Disney's not telling them to do it.
There might be a couple of other reasons there too.
I'm sure
but you know, Tom mentioned fandom, and I that was going to be my next question. We live in a moment with social media and things where I read in researching this just how vicious attacks have come against you personally, bringing up your family, bringing up everything from the comics gate community and all of that, taking it very aggressively personal against you because Bobby Drake is gay now, or things like that. And do you ever get nervous? How do you feel about that? And when you're making decisions and you're fighting with people who are 50 years old about these characters, when you're trying to sell to a younger audience, how do you balance this, and how do you not lose your temper?
Well, I think, you know, to your last point first, sometimes I do lose my temper.
Yeah, I know.
But you know, a couple of things on that. You know, the first one is I genuinely like the fan community. For the most part, I genuinely do like the fans, and I appreciate and understand their point of view. They're no different than me. I was a fan and a reader. I'm still a fan and a reader. I buy and read books every week. Although now with the corona, I have to have them sent to my house rather than going to a shop. But I still do that, and I understand that psychology. I understand the thing that drives them because I've been there. You know, that having been said, bad behavior is bad behavior. People being jerks are people being jerks.
Yeah.
You know, I haven't, you know, for all that I certainly, you know, for a while I was a good lightning rod because I would answer questions on Form Spring or whatever. I have not had it as bad as a lot of people in this industry who have been hounded and doxxed and tortured and tormented for the crime of being able to do a creative endeavor that the people that are poking at them would dearly love to be able to do, but can't or haven't. And you know, that behavior is just reprehensible, and it ought to stop. You know, but that all having been said, I appreciate the idea that any given reader's experience is going to be their own experience. So
Right.
if I put out an Iron Man story, whatever story that is, there are going to be people that love it and think it is the greatest Iron Man story that's ever been done. There are going to be people that like it and enjoy it and buy the next one. There are going to be people that are so-so about it. There are going to be people that didn't love it, but, you know, it doesn't rule their lives. And there are going to be people to whom I have forever destroyed the character of Iron Man. And that whole range is fine. It's all about how it gets expressed and how it gets acted upon. You know, in terms of, am I ever scared? I don't know if I'm ever scared per se. Every once in a while, there was one during the Secret Empire storyline where there was one death threat that was that seemed like, no, that could be a legitimate death threat. And it came from a guy that had a history of mental problems and so forth. And, you know, that one, you know, went up through Marvel security and so forth. And that one, anything like that, we'll take seriously.
Right, right.
But I also know that most of this stuff is just people blowing smoke.
Right, you know, most of it is, yeah.
I go to conventions, not this year so much, but I go to conventions. I'm easy to find online. I'm not hard to get a hold of, and you know, publicly and to my face, nobody's really been, you know, awful.
Right.
Yeah, even people that haven't liked a certain thing have observed the, you know, the social niceties when they've been there, either not saying anything or saying, yeah, I didn't like that. And that's fine. Like, I understand you have a love for this just like I do. And you don't like whatever creative choice was made. That's fair. Hopefully the choice we make next month will be better for you.
So now, and Jim brought up the Comicsgate people, and there's also just the flip end of it. There's the cancer culture thing of sometimes someone sees a panel from maybe 10 years ago that was okay then. Now it isn't. Now everyone wants that person. Now that group wants that person to be fired. It all feels like social media is adding a certain toxicity to the fandom issues that used to be contained in letters pages that you had some degree of control over. Do you ever kind of think like, man, I just want to has it ever gotten to that point emotional where you're like, I just kind of want to retire and get away from this?
No, it hasn't gotten to that. And I think that honestly, that toxicity doesn't come from the fandom and doesn't come from social media. It comes from the zeitgeist in the world.
Yeah. Okay.
We're in a very contentious period right now and have been for a couple of years, and that's tended to bring out the worst extremes of people on all sides of all of these issues. And so, this is a symptom. This isn't the illness. And it's when the situation itself changes or improves or gets better, that I think you'll see people behaving slightly better.
Now, when you you were promoted to senior vice president of publishing in 2011. So you have that title and the executive editor title, I think, currently, right?
Yeah, I keep a lot of titles around. It's good for impressing people.
Did that change your job titles as far as being senior VP of publishing?
Again,
or is that more a testament of like, this guy's been a solid company man, he's doing a lot of things around here, let's throw that title there? I mean, what happened?
There's more to it than just, hey, let's give him a title. But there's it's not like my job as with the VP of publishing on it versus before that was all that materially different. What it's a reflection of mostly, honestly, is the Disney structure.
Oh, okay.
That within the Disney hierarchy and dealing with people in other divisions, it's helpful to have a title that makes sense to those divisions, where they can go, oh, that guy's a VP, so when he says, whatever, Iron Man should be red and gold, he probably knows what he's talking about.
I see.
As opposed to anything else. It's sort of like, again, I won't say it was an empty or a meaningless title. There's, I've got more responsibility with that than I had before. But really, the frou-for-all there is really more about the internal political dynamics of the engine that is all the various Disney companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Paul Levitt said that, like with the Warner structure, that once that happened, then things were structured to reflect that, the new owner kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly that sort of thing. So my day-to-day hasn't changed all that much, but the title just means that, if I get a call or I have to interface with somebody at, I don't know, Disney Parks or something, they understand instinctively they're dealing with somebody on whatever level I happen to be on, and not just a guy from the mailroom.
As far as the movies, are we kind of in the movie age of comics where the movies are kind of driving a lot of the creative choices? Before it was like, let's get movies based on the comics that were made in vacuum without movie concerns. Now that the movie concerns are here, does that create like this almost, I guess you could call it a corporate synergy, but does that also reduce in some way the genuineness of the product? Does it in some way dilute the Marvel brand in that it's become a bit more movie oriented, or is that not real at all?
I don't think it's done most of that stuff. What it does do is it means that everything influences everything. On a day-to-day basis, as somebody working in Marvel Publishing, what my job is and what my goal is always is to be doing the stories that on some level can be raw material for what Studios does a couple of years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So the most obvious example of something like that is I do Winter Soldier, they make a Winter Soldier movie. Their Winter Soldier movie is not like the comic that Ed and I and Steve Epting did. It takes a few pieces of it, it remixes them, and works, it's built in a way that works really excellent for a 2-hour movie structure, as opposed to, a serialized comic. Yeah. But it's raw material and it's stories that got a reaction and that got people excited that they can look at and go, we could do something great with that in film. Right. So on all the books that we work on, we're constantly looking to be at the forefront of stuff. That having been said, it's not like the films don't have a huge influence over everybody, and that includes our creators. The example that we always use, and it's not the only one, is that after the first X-Men movie came out, everybody started drawing Cerebro as a giant round chamber with a catwalk in it.
Yes.
And that wasn't anybody at Marvel going, now Cerebro needs to look at that. It was everybody coming out of the movie theaters, who draws our books going, that looked cool.
Yeah.
So when Cerebro shows up in a plot, that's what they think of and that's what they draw.
Right.
There are times when the way the films will distill a character down, or the way they'll interpret them, or the way an actor will portray them will naturally translate back. I believe it is impossible today for anybody reading an Iron Man comic to not read it in Robert Downey's voice. And it almost doesn't matter who writes it or what the dialogue is. Yeah. That actor is so associated with that character that you almost can't help but hear it as Downey when he speaks. And so there's always going to be that synergistic influence. But, and there are times, like I said earlier, we know that an Eternals movie is coming, so we'll do a book. The book we're doing is not going to be their movie. Will it take bits and pieces from it if we happen to know characters are featured or that they're doing something specific? That'll inform our choice making and our decision process.
Right.
But the stories that we tell, again, the hope is really maybe this will be Eternals 2 or Eternals 3. That there'll be stuff here that they go, yeah, this is in the same way that as they do whatever films that they've done so far and will continue to do, they get to cherry pick all the best stuff from all the stories that have existed so far.
Okay.
Very quickly, what about going for DC Comics from New 52 to the recent news and the basic destruction of DC? Do y'all view that as a positive or a negative in terms of Marvel? Because isn't it good to have a competitor, to have a strong Democratic and Republican Party, to have a rivalry?
Look, I wanna do better than DC, on the racks, but I certainly don't want DC to fail or to fall apart or to go away. I think the industry as a whole is better and stronger and better for everybody, retailers, creators, editors, publishers alike. If there are, technically, in my perfect world, there'd be 3 companies at a certain level, and there tends to be more like 2.5 these days. But yeah, I want DC to do well. I want to do better than them, and I work and fight every month to try to do better than them, and they hopefully are working and fighting every month to try and do better than me. And some months I win and some months they win. But yeah, it's, again, I went through those Marvel layoffs of the 90s, and I know a bunch of the people that got taken out during this wave at DC, and a bunch of the people that are still there. And so I know what they're in for, and I know what they've experienced, and it's horrifying and heartbreaking, and I hate it. But again, all I can do is hope for the best. Hope that things turn around for them and move in a positive direction, and that everything is it works out.
And my next question is, some of my favorite books of the last 2 years have been published by First Second or young adult in nature, and they're really doing some interesting things. And Marvel is doing it as well, and they're very aware. And when fan people, sometimes comic book historians, talk about Marvel failing and not sales being down and everything, I think they don't understand how much business y'all get from that kind of selling to a different audience, the book fairs and the children's bookstores.
For sure.
And I just wanted to ask you to confirm that and talk about that for a second.
Yes, you are absolutely right. Obviously, we don't sell the same thing through every chain to every person, and what a particular product does in one distribution market does not reflect what it does in all of them. We are very simple folk at Marvel. We like to make money. We like to make a lot of it, as much of it as we possibly can. So if you're looking at a situation and going, well, that book doesn't seem to be performing very well, it can't be making much money or any money at all, why the hell are they doing it? chances are the answer is because it makes a lot of money over here where you just don't happen to be seeing it. And we like having a lot of money, and we don't care so much that it doesn't make as much money over here. It's at the end of the day, all the loot goes into the same big bag with a dollar sign on it, as long as that money is coming in, and there's an audience there that can be tapped, and we can expand the scope and the reach of the Marvel characters and further conquer the world. That's something that we're all about doing. Certainly that YA space has been exploding for a decade now as a category in publishing, and we certainly have taken steps and will continue to take more to expand what we're doing there and to capture a portion of that audience until we have it all.
So you're not doing it to bow to social justice warriors or some feminist agenda or anything else. It's because you make money off of it, correct?
We are greedy. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with putting forth a positive message. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being inclusive and having comics that reflect the wide variety and spectrum of human experiences, because we want to get everybody, and we want everybody to feel like there's a place for them at Marvel. But when you dig down, we're a very profit-oriented organization, and we want to have more money at the end of the year than we started with, and that's always going to drive our business decisions in aggregate. So yeah, the people that are like, oh, comic sales are failing, I've been hearing that since before I was in the industry. And again, if you bet on failure long enough, sooner or later you'll be right, because eventually the sun goes nova, the universe ends, everything, heat death of the universe. It's a safe money bet, but I'm doing well. Marvel's doing well. We did well last year. We're doing better this year. Hopefully, we'll do better next year. And we're doing really well right now in the middle of a pandemic where our whole distribution network fell apart for a couple of months. So the sky is falling rhetoric. If it serves some people and makes them happy, whatever. God love them. There ain't a lot of reality to it.
And I just want to close with saying that what I like about Marvel is it's still recognizable under all circumstances. And this morning at like 3 a.m, I'm reading the snapshots of Fantastic Four that Dorkin wrote. And it's a beautiful book, and it's Johnny Storm, and I recognize who it is. And I can't wait for the Mark Russell Captain America. And you guys understand your characters, and we appreciate it.
Well, we love the fact that not only are you reading, but you have been reading for so long. I quite like the fact that you had a Kid Flash costume, even though that's not a Marvel thing. Thank you so much. We try not to take your readership for granted. We know that we have to earn your allegiance every, one comic at a time, one story at a time, every time you go, and that's what we try to do. And sometimes we don't do as well, and sometimes the cake doesn't come out as good as we'd hoped. But our goal is to hit it as often as possible, and to provide everybody with some entertainment and some enjoyment and some joy in their lives.
Yeah, something I want to point out is that when it comes to Marvel and your involvement with Marvel, you are that Marvel company guy that weathered all sorts of crazy storms. Have you been there longer? John Romita Sr. was like that, like the way you are with that. Right. And then Stan Lee, obviously, he was there longer than anybody. But are you there longer than the years that John Romita was there?
Well, I think the answer is ultimately yes. Because John retired in '96.
Yeah. That's like 29 years or 30 years or something, right?
Yeah, he came back to Marvel in '66. So that's a 30-year thing. But when he came back, I don't know that he was working in the office. He wasn't necessarily on staff. He would come in and he would operate as Stan's pair of hands to do corrections and things.
Yes.
And work in the office. But even assuming that you say that that's 30 years, I'm longer than that. Stan obviously was longer than me. Ralph Macchio was still longer than me. So there are a few people who've been at Marvel longer or who are more, long tenured than I, but not many.
Yeah, not many. Yeah, you're basically
over 30 years. Wow.
Yeah, more than 30 years. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you're there longer than Romita Sr. That's a testament to you being truly a Marvel guy, even though that's where, although it was from affidavit fraud, but still. But at any rate, well, thanks so much, Tom Brevoort. We had a great time chatting with you today. You gave us some great insights on some goings on. And we're always excited to hear about what's next coming from Marvel.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me.